I never thought a single word no could burn my whole world to the ground. But that morning, when my sister demanded I cancel the biggest job interview of my life just to drive her to the mall, something inside me finally snapped. I'd spent years swallowing my pride, letting everyone else's needs come before mine. But when I refused, my father didn't just get angry. He grabbed my arm and slammed me against the wall, as if my dreams were nothing but an inconvenience. And the worst part, they told me her future mattered, and mine never did. What they didn't know, what no one in that house ever bothered to ask, was that I had been carrying a secret success they couldn't even imagine. And the moment I walked out that door, everything they'd taken for granted began to crumble, fast. If you stay with me, I promise you this. You'll hear every lie they told, every trap they set, every cruel twist I didn't see coming. And you'll hear exactly how I turned it all around, how the girl they dismissed and pushed aside brought their entire world to its knees. This isn't just a story about a family falling apart. It's about what happens when the quiet one finally says enough. My name is Jennifer Brooks. I'm 36 years old, and I work as a project coordinator for a technology firm that lets me work mostly from home. People often assume my life is quiet and uneventful, and I've learned not to correct them. I've always been the kind of woman who gets things done without drawing attention, someone who has carried her own weight since she was young. Maybe that's why no one in my family ever thought to ask how I was really doing. They assumed I was fine. They always did. When I drove back to my parents' house that weekend, I knew exactly what I was walking into. I'd been away for months, busy with deadlines and preparing for an upcoming interview that could change my entire career. But the moment I stepped through the front door, it was like I'd never left. My mother barely looked up from the kitchen counter. My father gave me a half-hearted nod. And Emily, my younger sister, came floating in from the living room like she was the star of some family show, because in their eyes she always was. "There she is," my mother said, but she wasn't looking at me. She brushed past me to check the curls in Emily's hair, fixing a loose strand with the kind of careful attention she hadn't shown me since I was a child. "You look beautiful, sweetheart. Did you tell Jennifer about your plans yet?" Emily gave me a smile that felt more like a performance than a greeting. "I'm thinking about buying a new dress for that party next week," she said, not bothering to ask how I'd been or why I'd come. That was normal. She talked and everyone listened. I existed in the background, expected to nod along and be supportive. We sat down for dinner shortly after. My mother had made all of Emily's favourites, baked chicken with rosemary buttery mashed potatoes, and the peach cobbler Emily loved since she was 12. No one asked what I liked. No one ever did. My mother placed a small portion in front of me like she was feeding someone who happened to wander in, then turned her full attention back to Emily. All through the meal, the conversation circled around my sister, her classes, her friends, a boy she liked, the discount sale at the mall she wanted to check out. My father leaned in to hear every detail, nodding proudly, as if Emily's smallest thought was worth celebrating. When I mentioned gently that I had a big week coming up with an important interview, the table went silent for a moment, and then Emily interrupted. "Oh, speaking of that," she said, pointing her fork at me as if I were an assistant instead of her sister. "I might need a ride to the mall Monday morning. There's a sale and I don't want to miss it." My father chuckled. "You know how she is, Jen. Always planning ahead. You can help her out." Just like that, the attention swung right back to Emily. My mother asked about colours, shoes, accessories. My father shared a story about how Emily used to dress up for school dances. Laughter floated around me, pleasant and warm, but I wasn't part of it. I was sitting right there, but I wasn't really there. And at my age, you notice things like that more deeply. You feel how small a person can become inside their own childhood home. I answered when spoken to. I smiled when someone glanced my way. I cleaned my plate quietly and thanked my mother for dinner. I did all the things I'd done my whole life to keep the peace, to keep myself from becoming the problem. Being overlooked had become such a normal state of existence that I hardly recognised it anymore. It felt more like a role I had learned to play than something I chose. But that night, as I set my empty dish in the sink, I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. Something was shifting quietly, but clearly like the soft crack before a branch breaks under its own weight. I didn't know it then, but I was standing at the edge of the moment that would change everything. Because later that night, one small request was about to turn my whole world upside down. I held on to that uneasy feeling for the rest of the evening, the heaviness that had gathered in my chest like a quiet warning. By the time I walked upstairs to the old guest room, the house had settled into its usual nighttime rhythm. Television, murmuring downstairs, my mother fussing in the kitchen, Emily humming along to some songs she liked. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive. That was the truth of it. The worst moments in my family never came like storms. They arrived quietly disguised as ordinary conversations and expectations that somehow only ever seemed to fall on my shoulders. I set my bag by the bed and sat down, breathing in the familiar scent of old sheets and lavender detergent. This room had once been mine years ago. Now it felt like I was borrowing space in a home that had learned to function without me. Even though I was the eldest daughter, I had never been the centre of anything. My parents leaned on me when they needed help, but they celebrated Emily. They listened to Emily. They shaped the world around her needs while trusting that I would simply adapt. For most of my life, I didn't question it. I told myself that being strong meant needing less. But that night, I felt that belief slipping away. I could almost sense the split forming the fracture between the daughter I had been taught to be and the woman I was becoming. I lay awake longer than I meant to, replaying dinner in my mind. Emily's voice bright and expectant. My father's approving nods. My mother's hands reaching to adjust Emily's hair, her collar, her plait, everything. The way they all seemed to orbit her as if she were the sun and the rest of us were meant to move around her. I tried to shrug it off to remind myself that families had patterns and habits, and ours was just one of those things you learnt to live with. But it didn't ease anything. I felt small in a way that didn't match the life I had built for myself outside these walls. At work, people listened to me. My opinion mattered. I had a place and a purpose. But here, I sank back into an old role without even trying. By the time I drifted into sleep, my mind was tired and my heart felt bruised in a quiet, private way. I didn't yet know why that heaviness felt different from all the others I had carried. Looking back, I think something inside me already sensed that this visit would not end like the others, that something was about to break. I woke up early the next morning before anyone else was up. Sunlight drifted through the curtains, soft and warm, and for a brief moment I felt calm. I walked downstairs quietly, hoping for a peaceful start to the day, maybe even a cup of coffee before the house came alive with demands and opinions. I was halfway to the kitchen when I heard the familiar rustle of my father's newspaper. He was sitting at the table, glasses perched low on his nose, drinking his first cup of coffee. He looked up when he heard me, but his expression didn't soften. It rarely did when it came to me. "Morning," he said, as if the word were a chore he needed to get through. "Morning," I answered, trying to keep my tone gentle. He folded the newspaper with a slow, deliberate motion. "Your sister has a lot on her plate." He began, skipping any kind of greeting or casual conversation. "She's young, she's trying to figure things out." I didn't respond right away. Comments like that always led somewhere uncomfortable. "I know she's young," I said carefully. My father took a long sip of coffee. "Her future is important. She needs support right now. Real support." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what he was building toward. He continued, a slight edge creeping into his tone. "You've always been fine on your own. You don't need the same attention she does. You never did." There it was, the familiar refrain, as if independence were a blessing I'd been born with rather than something they forced me to learn. As if being fine meant I didn't feel anything, didn't want anything, didn't deserve anything. I took a breath, hoping to steady myself. "Dad, I do understand that Emily needs support, but I have things going on too." He waved that off with a small gesture, dismissive in a way that stung more than I expected. "You're strong. You'll be all right. Your sister isn't like you. She needs more." I felt something tighten inside me, a small knot of frustration mixed with sadness. Needing more doesn't mean I need nothing, I said. My voice was calm, but I knew he wouldn't really hear the weight behind it. He leaned back in his chair. Older daughters sacrifice. That's how families work. You should know that by now. The words landed like a slap, not loud but sharp. I stood there quiet, letting the sentence sink into me. Older daughters sacrifice. Not because they choose to, but because they're expected to. Because everyone assumes they can handle it. I had heard versions of that message my entire life, but never so plainly. My mother entered the kitchen just then, tying her robe around her waist, already nodding along as if she'd heard the whole conversation. Your father's right, she said without hesitation. You've always been the steady one. Emily needs a little more help? She looked at me like this was something I should accept as naturally as breathing. It's just how things are. I smiled, or tried to, though I could feel the weight of their words pressing against me. It wasn't a real smile. It was habit, a mask I had learnt to wear since I was old enough to understand this family's order. I didn't trust my voice, so I didn't say much else. I just nodded, pretending the comments didn't hurt. Pretending I didn't feel that quiet ache rising again, heavier than the night before. But something was changing. I could feel it. Their words didn't slide off me the way they used to. They didn't disappear into the background. They settled sharp and cold, stirring something inside me that I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. I made my coffee and stepped back, letting the rhythm of the kitchen fill in the silence. My mother talked about Emily's plans. My father returned to his paper. And I stood there hearing myself breathe, feeling a shift so small it was almost invisible, but so certain it made the room feel different. I didn't know yet what that shift would grow into. I didn't know the storm it would lead to. But a few minutes later, as I sipped my coffee, I realised I was no longer willing to shrink myself to fit into their idea of who I should be. And the next morning, I heard the most unreasonable demand yet. Those words stayed with me as I moved through the house, carrying the weight of everything that had been said. I could feel my parents settling into their familiar pattern, the one where Emily's needs set the tone for the day, and mine was something they assumed would fall into place on their own. At that moment, I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't ready to break away or speak out. I was simply tired, in a way that felt old, as if I had been tired for years without realising it. That morning didn't create the exhaustion, it only uncovered it. I was still the quiet daughter who found ways to keep the peace, but something inside me had begun to shift, and I could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. I walked back to the guest room after breakfast, trying to gather my thoughts. The house looked the same as always, the same framed photos, the same worn rug in the hallway, the same faint scent of lemon cleaner. But my relationship to everything in it felt different. It was almost as if the house itself reminded me of the role I had been assigned long before I knew how to speak up for myself. I could feel the walls holding stories I hadn't faced in years. Stories of the dependable daughter, the quiet fixer, the one who grew up too fast because there was no other option. I sat down on the edge of the bed and let my mind drift back to the memories that shaped who I had become. When I was 9, I remembered being the one who packed my own lunch every morning while my mother braided Emily's hair for kindergarten. My father would praise Emily for her neat little braids and her bright smile, while barely noticing the mismatched socks I'd thrown on in a hurry. It wasn't that my parents were cruel. They just assumed I would be all right. I was the responsible one, the helper. Emily was the one who needed attention, and so she received all of it. Those patterns built themselves slowly, so gently, I hardly noticed the imbalance until I was much older. By 13, I was doing my own laundry, cooking simple meals and helping my mother with chores my sister was never asked to do. My parents would tell their friends how mature I was, how lucky they felt to have a daughter who never caused trouble. I would smile and nod, even though part of me wondered why being dependable felt more like a sentence than a compliment. Emily, meanwhile, was celebrated for everything, no matter how small. If she drew a picture, it went on the fridge. If she won a participation ribbon, my father brought it up at dinner. When I earned straight A's, they said, "Of course you did," and moved on. That, of course, stayed with me long after the moment passed, pressing me into a shape they expected, rather than allowing me to be someone with needs of my own. Still, I kept doing what was asked. I thought that was what good daughters did. I learned to anticipate problems before they happened to shield my family from stress, to make myself smaller so others could feel bigger. And maybe I would have kept living that way forever, if it weren't for the rare moments when someone saw me, truly saw me. My aunt, my father's older sister, was one of the only people who ever broke through the fog of expectation that surrounded me. She lived only a few hours away, and whenever she visited, she looked at me with a kind of knowing that no one else bothered to show. She never spoke badly about my parents, but she watched them closely the way a person watches a pattern they've seen before. When she hugged me, she held me longer than necessary, as if trying to reassure me that someone understood how much weight I carried. I remember one afternoon when I was 15. My parents were busy preparing for a dinner with friends, and Emily was sprawled on the couch, refusing to help with anything. I stood in the kitchen, washing dishes for the second time that day when my aunt walked in. She didn't tell me to put the sponge down or scold my parents for letting me do so much. She simply placed a soft hand on my shoulder and said in a quiet voice, "You don't always have to be the strong one, sweetheart." No one had ever said that to me. I didn't know how to respond, so I smiled and kept scrubbing, but her words carved a tiny space inside me, a place where the truth could breathe. As the years passed, my aunt became the person I called whenever I felt overwhelmed. She listened without judgment. She reminded me that being capable didn't mean I had to carry everything alone. She spoke gently, but there was firmness in her voice, like she was trying to unteach years of conditioning without tearing my world apart. After I moved out on my own, her calls became a lifeline. She always checked on me in ways my parents never thought to. She asked how I felt, what I wanted, what I dreamed of becoming. She saw me outside the box my parents put me in, and even though I didn't fully step out of that box, she made me aware that it existed. Now, sitting in the guest room of my parents' house, I remembered all of that, the imbalance, the weight of expectation, the small kindnesses that held me together. I could feel the old version of myself trying to rise, the one who accepted everything without question, who smoothed tension by sacrificing her own needs. But the woman I had grown into felt the shift more clearly now. I wasn't the same quiet girl who swallowed her feelings. I had built a life where my voice mattered, and the contrast between that life and this house was becoming sharper every minute. My aunt had called me the night before my trip and told me to stay grounded, to listen to myself as much as I listened to everyone else. She didn't know what would happen during this visit, but sometimes I wondered if she sensed things before they unfolded. She always did have a way of speaking to the hidden parts of my life, the parts I ignored because it was easier than confronting the truth. Thinking of her that morning made something inside me tighten. I knew she would never ask me to give up my own happiness for someone else's convenience. She believed in balance, in fairness, in the idea that families should support each other without taking advantage. And as I sat there replaying the years in my head, the praise Emily received, the expectations placed on me, the quiet battles I fought alone, I felt that balance slipping completely out of reach. I took a slow breath, trying to steady the swirl of memories. I wasn't a child anymore. I wasn't helpless. But I could see now how easily I still slid into old roles. That morning, after everything my parents had said, I knew something was coming. Something unreasonable, something predictable, something I had allowed for too long. And this time, I wasn't sure I could bend the way I used to. But this visit home was about to cross a line I couldn't ignore. I didn't know how quickly that line would be crossed, or how casual the moment would feel before everything inside me began to tilt. That morning, I was still carrying the weight of old memories, the ones that had surfaced while I was sitting alone in the guest room. I felt unsettled, but steady aware of my place in this house, yet more conscious than ever of how much I no longer fit within its old expectations. I was the dependable daughter, the quiet one, the one who never asked for too much. But beneath that surface, something firmer had taken root. I wasn't ready for a confrontation, but I also wasn't ready to shrink anymore, not the way I always had. I walked into the kitchen around mid-morning, still thinking through how the day might unfold. My interview was scheduled just after noon, and I planned to drive into town early so I could collect my thoughts and review the details. This interview mattered. It wasn't a simple job upgrade. It was a chance to move forward in a way I had worked toward for years. The kind of opportunity people only got once or twice in their lifetime. I knew my parents didn't understand the significance of it, but I hoped at least they would respect the commitment. Emily was already sitting at the kitchen table, legs folded beneath her like a child scrolling on her phone with her usual careless ease. My mother hovered over her offering slices of fruit and asking about outfits as if they were discussing a major life decision instead of a casual day out. My father sat nearby, nodding at everything Emily said as if each word deserved applause. Emily looked up as soon as I entered. She didn't smile. She just looked expectant, the way someone might look at a waiter approaching their table. "Oh, good. You're up," she said, sliding her phone across the table toward me. "I need you to drive me to the mall today. There's a huge sale and it starts at 11. If we leave soon, we can get there right when it opens." I blinked, not sure if I heard her correctly. "You need me to drive you today?" I asked, already sensing where this was going. She sighed as if I were the one being unreasonable. "Yes, it's important, Jen." "I can't miss this sale. If I don't get there early, everything good will be gone." I glanced at the clock. It was barely past 9. My chest tightened when I realised what she was implying. "Emily, I have my interview today. I need to be there before noon." My father folded his newspaper with a sound that carried more judgment than the action deserved. "Can't they reschedule it?" he asked, as if rearranging major career events was as simple as moving a dentist appointment. "It's a final interview," I said quietly. "And it's important," Emily shrugged, brushing invisible dust off her sleeve. "Can't you just drive me first? You're always early to everything. Drop me off, then go to your interview." "That wouldn't give me enough time," I replied. "I need to prepare, and I can't rush in late." My mother's voice slipped in with that familiar soft pressure. "Honey, your sister really needs to go," she said. "She's been talking about this all week." "She doesn't ask for much. She asks for plenty," I said before I could stop myself. My voice wasn't angry, just tired, worn down in a way I could feel behind my ribs. My father frowned. "Your interview will be fine, Jennifer. You always manage things. Emily, on the other hand, needs a little extra help. She's still trying to figure out her path." Emily nodded quickly, eager for the support. "Exactly. This is important to me." A familiar chill ran through me. They didn't even try to hide it. This belief that Emily's needs always came first. The way they said she needed more wasn't just a statement. It was a rule they had lived by for years. Somehow her desire for a new dress carried more weight than my future. "I can't take you," I said, keeping my tone steady. "I have to focus on my interview. I can't miss it." My mother looked genuinely surprised, as if she'd never heard me turn down anything before. "Jennifer," she said softly, "your sister's future matters too." My father added, "Emily has opportunities she could lose if she doesn't get the right clothes or the right timing. You don't need things like that. You've always been fine on your own." There it was again, that familiar dismissal wrapped in praise, as if being strong meant I didn't have hopes or plans that mattered. I set my coffee down slowly. My heart beat heavy but even. "My interview is important," I said again more firmly this time. "I've been preparing for weeks. It's not something I can reschedule." Emily rolled her eyes. "You're being dramatic. It's just an interview." My father leaned forward. "Jennifer, do this for your sister. She needs it more than you do. Her future is still being shaped. You're already settled." Settled. As if my life was something static, something finished, something that required no further effort or hope. As if the years I had spent building myself didn't count because I did them alone. I looked at each of them. My sister, fresh-faced and careless. My mother, already disappointed in me. My father, expecting obedience. And I felt that shift inside me again stronger now, like something finally snapping into place. "I'm not driving you," I said quietly. Emily's mouth fell open in disbelief. "What do you mean, you're not? You always help me." "I can't, today," I replied. "I have something important I need to do." My mother shook her head with gentle disappointment, the kind that always made me feel 12 years old again. "Jennifer older daughter's sacrifice," she said, echoing the line from the day before. "It's part of being in a family." A warmth spread across my chest. Not anger yet, but a clean, honest clarity. I wasn't asking for more than they could give. I was asking for the bare minimum respect for something that mattered to me. For a moment, I wondered if this was the first time I had ever truly asked for it. My father sighed, frustrated. "Why are you being difficult? Just take her." But this time, I didn't fold. I didn't shrink. I simply stood there in the kitchen of the house where I had swallowed my needs for decades, and I held my ground. And for the first time, I said no. The word was still echoing in my mind, sharp and unfamiliar, as if it didn't quite belong to the version of myself my family expected to see. I stood in the kitchen, feeling every pair of eyes on me. My father's startled, my mother's disappointed, and Emily's wide with disbelief. The air in the room shifted not dramatically, but in a way that made my skin prickle as if something long buried had stirred to the surface. I hadn't meant to start a battle. I had only meant to draw a line. But even that felt like a rebellion in a house where my compliance had always been taken for granted. My mother was the first to react. She pressed her hand flat against the counter, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jennifer, you don't mean that. You've always helped your sister. She's counting on you." Her tone carried an ache that tugged at the oldest parts of me, the parts that hated disappointing anyone, especially her. For most of my life, I had been the one to smooth rough moments, the one to give in before conflict grew too sharp. I knew that tone well. It was the one that made me fold, made me quietly reorganize my own plans to make room for theirs. But today, it pressed against something that refused to bend. "I do mean it," I said gently, even though my heart was pushing against my ribs. "I've worked hard for this interview. I can't risk missing it." My father let out a short, incredulous laugh. "It's just an interview, Jennifer. They'll schedule another. But your sister needs you today, and she can't get there on her own." That old familiar guilt rose inside me, steady and predictable, like a tide I had lived with my entire life. I knew every angle of it, how it started as a small pinch and grew heavier, urging me to put myself last because everyone else needed me more. My family never had to force that guilt onto me. It grew naturally from the years I spent being the one who didn't cause trouble, the one who stepped in when others faltered. Standing in that kitchen, I felt it pulling at me again. A voice deep inside whispered that it would be easier to give in, easier to surrender a few hours of my day than endure the rising tension in the room. For a moment, I nearly did. I nearly apologized, nearly said I could rearrange things, nearly offered to drive her before my interview and rush the rest. That instinct was powerful, worn into me like a groove carved by decades of repetition. But another voice rose up this time, new, steady and painfully honest. It reminded me of every moment I had chosen them over myself without hesitation. I remembered staying home from senior year orientation because Emily had a cold and didn't want to be alone. I remembered cancelling plans in college to drive home and help with chores my sister refused to do. I remembered the night I stayed up until sunrise, writing Emily's paper because she wasn't in the right headspace. I remembered all of it, all the ways I had learned to sacrifice without even calling it sacrifice. And the truth hit me in a way it never had before. None of those moments had changed anything. None of them brought me closer to being seen. None of them earned the love or recognition I had hoped for. They only taught my family that I would always step aside no matter the cost. "My interview is important," I said again, though my voice trembled. "I'm not cancelling it." Emily scoffed in a way that made me feel both sad and strangely grateful. Sad because it showed how little she understood, and grateful because her reaction held up a mirror I hadn't looked into before. "You're overreacting," she said. "I just asked for a ride. You make everything dramatic." That sentence sliced through me. I remembered being 15, standing in the rain, outside my high school because my parents forgot to pick me up after Emily's recital. They said I made too much of it when I cried. I remembered years later when I lost myself in overdue responsibilities and exhaustion and mentioned feeling overwhelmed. My mother told me I was being sensitive. Every moment of hurt I had ever expressed was minimized, dismissed, or explained away. I wasn't overreacting now. I was waking up. I pulled in a steady breath, trying to keep my voice even. Emily, I'm not available this morning. I told you why. My father leaned forward, elbows on the table, his jaw tightening. Why are you being so stubborn? He asked. Your sister depends on you. His words landed with a weight I'd felt too many times. They weren't asking for help. They were demanding it, expecting it, insisting it was my duty. And even though part of me still longed to make them proud, another part, the part that had carried years of unspoken disappointment, rose to the surface. For once, I said softly, I need to depend on myself. My father stared at me like I was speaking a language he didn't understand. My mother turned away, shaking her head as if my choice were a personal betrayal. The floor felt unsteady beneath me, but I held my ground. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear of the conflict, but from the weight of choosing myself in a house where I had never been my own priority. I reminded myself of everything that brought me to this moment. My years of hard work, the nights spent studying, the quiet promotions no one at home ever asked about, the moments I lifted myself up, while my family assumed I was already standing tall. I reminded myself that the life I built outside these walls was real, meaningful, and mine, and I wasn't going to throw it away, not for a sale, not for an errand, not for anyone's careless expectations. I am going to my interview, I said for the first time with complete clarity. I'm not cancelling it. The entire kitchen fell still as if every molecule in the air paused. Emily dropped her eyes to her phone, pretending not to care, even though her lips pressed into a thin line. My mother stepped back as if disappointed in the person she thought she could always rely on, and my father's expression hardened in a way I had never seen before, quiet, cold, offended by the idea that I had dared to draw a boundary he didn't approve of. It was a small word, just 2 letters, but it carried 36 years of unspoken longing, hurt and hope. It carried all the moments I swallowed my own needs. It carried the stillness of someone who had finally chosen her own path, even if no one else understood why. I turned to step away from the table, my heartbeat steadying as I realised that this decision, this refusal, was the first real step toward the life I wanted. But as I did, I felt the heat of my father's stare on my back, sharp and simmering like pressure building before a storm breaks. And that one word made my father explode. His reaction came faster than I expected, almost as if he had been holding something in for years, and my refusal finally snapped the thread. I had barely taken 2 steps away from the table when his chair scraped sharply across the floor. The sound cut through the kitchen, startling enough to make me turn back before I was ready. I knew my father could become stern, even harsh, when things didn't go his way, but nothing prepared me for the sudden shift in his face. The calm, controlled expression he usually wore had vanished. In its place was something tight red and simmering an anger that didn't match the situation, as if my refusal had reached some place inside him he didn't know how to handle. "What did you just say?" he barked, stepping toward me with heavy, deliberate movements. His voice filled the room loud enough to make my pulse jump. I stood still, not because I wanted to, but because my feet felt rooted to the floor. I had seen him annoyed before, frustrated, even disappointed, but this was something else entirely. I wasn't sure if it was shock or fear tightening in my chest, but I knew the room had suddenly changed, as if the air itself had grown sharper. I said, "I'm not cancelling my interview." I answered, my voice was steady, though everything inside me felt unsteady. "I'm not taking Emily to the mall." He stared at me as if I had said something obscene. "Unbelievable," he muttered, then raised his voice again. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us. You're selfish, ungrateful." Those two words struck harder than I expected. I had spent most of my life trying to be the opposite of those things, trying to be helpful, responsible, dependable. The idea that he could look at me after years of sacrifice and see someone selfish felt like a slap. But I held my ground even as the weight of his accusation settled on my shoulders. "I'm not ungrateful," I said softly. "I just need to put myself first today. Just today." My father didn't hear the tremor in my voice or didn't care. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You think your little interview matters more than your family? You think you're better than us?" "I never said that," I whispered, but he was no longer listening. Behind him, my mother froze, torn between calming him and supporting him. She didn't say a word, and Emily, leaning casually against the counter, watched the scene unfold with a blank expression, as if all of this were mildly inconvenient rather than alarming. My father jabbed a finger toward my face. "We gave you everything," he growled. "A roof, food, support. And you can't do this one simple thing. One simple thing, meaning rearrange my future for a dress sale. One simple thing, meaning erase myself all over again." I swallowed, feeling something inside me fold, then unfold again. "I can't," I repeated. "I'm not doing it." That was the moment he lost control. It happened so fast I barely had time to react. His hand shot out, gripping my arm with a force that shocked me. Before I could pull away, he shoved me backward. My shoulders hit the wall behind me with a dull thud that sent a jolt through my body. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Not because of the impact, but because of the disbelief that this was actually happening. My father had laid a heavy hand on my life in many ways: expectation, criticism, disappointment, but he had never physically pushed me before. Not like this. Not with the kind of force that came from a place far deeper than frustration. His face was inches from mine, twisted in anger. His voice thundered in my ear. "You don't get to disrespect this family," he said. "Not in this house." I stood there against the wall, stunned, my heartbeat pounding so loudly I could barely make out the rest of what he said. I tried to move to pull away, but I felt frozen, as if my body didn't know how to respond to this version of him. It wasn't fear of being hurt physically that overwhelmed me. It was the shock of seeing how little my feelings, my hopes, my future meant to the people who were supposed to care the most. Emily finally spoke, but her voice didn't carry concern or alarm. She crossed her arms and let out a cold, dismissive sigh. "God, Jennifer," she said, "you always make things dramatic." Her tone landed almost as heavily as my father's shove. She wasn't shaken, she wasn't startled. It was as if she expected my father's anger, expected me to be the problem, expected me to absorb the blame. And in that moment, any illusion I had about how she saw me crumbled completely. My mother finally reached for my father's arm, though her grip wasn't strong enough to pull him back. "Please," she said softly, "stop." She didn't mean to talk back. She just doesn't understand how important today is for Emily. Something inside me snapped, not loudly, not violently, but with the quiet finality of a thread breaking after years of strain. I pushed away from the wall with a small shaky breath and stepped out of my father's reach. My arm still throbbed from where he'd grabbed it, and my back ached from the impact. But the deeper pain came from the look on all their faces. Not fear, not regret, not concern, just annoyance, inconvenience, as if I had made a scene for no reason. "I'm going to my interview," I said. My voice wasn't strong, but it was steady. For the first time, I didn't try to soften my tone or swallow my emotions. I spoke plainly, honestly, from a place inside me I hadn't accessed before. My father stared at me, his chest rising and falling with anger. My mother looked between us, torn but unwilling to stand with me. And Emily rolled her eyes again as if the drama were tiring for her. I walked past them, each step slow but intentional. Their silence followed me through the hallway, heavy and strange, as if we all sensed a line had been crossed that none of us would be able to step back over. I reached the staircase and placed my hand on the banister, feeling a slight tremble in my fingers. It wasn't the push that shook me the most. It was the realization that there was no shock in the room, but mine. That no one rushed to me, no one asked if I was all right, no one showed even a flicker of guilt or remorse. That moment, I realized I was never truly seen as a daughter. Those words kept echoing in my mind as I stood there at the bottom of the stairs, my back still aching from the wall I'd been shoved against, and my heart pounding with a rhythm I couldn't steady. I didn't move right away. I don't think my body knew what to do. Part of me expected someone to call after me to apologize, to explain, to show even the smallest sign that what had just happened was wrong. But the house stayed silent, heavy, with a kind of tension that felt familiar and foreign at the same time. My father remained in the kitchen behind me, breathing hard. My mother hovered between us motionless, and Emily, somewhere in the background, had already gone back to her phone. The message was clear. If I was waiting for someone to reach for me, I'd be waiting forever. I took a slow breath and climbed the stairs. My legs felt unsteady, and my hand gripped the railing harder than I meant to. When I reached the guest room, I closed the door behind me and leaned against it for a moment, letting the quiet sink in. The room felt different now. It wasn't a place to rest or regroup anymore. It was a room I needed to leave. I didn't make the decision consciously. It rose through me like instinct, like breath, like something that had been waiting for years. My suitcase was still open on the floor from the night before. I dropped to my knees beside it, the motion almost automatic, and began packing the few things I had brought with me. My hands trembled so much I fumbled with the zipper on my toiletries bag. Tears burned the back of my eyes, but none of them fell. I wasn't crying from sadness. It was something else, shock maybe, or the sudden clarity that comes when the truth finally breaks through denial. I had been overlooked, dismissed, blamed, and taken for granted my entire life, but being shoved like that made everything suddenly brutally obvious. This house wasn't safe for me. Maybe it never had been. I folded my clothes mechanically, barely noticing what I was doing. Each piece of fabric felt like a small step towards something new, something I didn't fully understand yet. I was hurt, deeply hurt. But beneath the ache was a strange sense of calm. Not peace exactly, but a stillness as if the ground beneath me had stopped shifting. I didn't know what the next hours would bring, or how my family would react to me leaving, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sliver of control. When I zipped the suitcase shut, the sound felt loud in the tiny room. Final. I stood, wiped my palms on my jeans, and opened the door. As I walked toward the stairs, I could hear my parents talking in hushed tones, below sharp whispers, the kind that carried judgment and irritation, not concern. Their voices grew clearer as I reached the last step. My mother looked up first. Her eyes widened as she saw the suitcase in my hand. My father stiffened but didn't speak. Emily peeked around the corner, expression unreadable. "What are you doing?" my mother asked, her voice thin and strained. "I'm leaving," I said simply. My voice came out steadier than I felt, but the words were true, and they felt right. My mother moved toward me, shaking her head. "Jennifer, don't be ridiculous. You're upset. You need to calm down before you do something you regret." I shook my own head. "I'm not upset," I said. "I'm done." The difference surprised even me. A flicker of panic crossed her face, but it was quickly swallowed by something harder. "If you walk out now," she said, lifting her chin, "don't come back expecting us to fix things. Don't come running here if you get into trouble." Her warning stung, but not in the way she intended. It didn't sound like a boundary born from love. It sounded like a punishment meant to frighten me into staying small. "I've never run to you for anything," I replied quietly. "Not really." My father's jaw tightened. "So that's it. You're leaving because you didn't get your way." I felt that sentence the way someone feels a bruise when it's pressed too hard. "I'm leaving because I was pushed against a wall in my own parents' house," I said. "And because none of you seem to care." My father's face darkened, but he didn't deny it. That silence told me everything. Emily stepped forward, arms crossed, voice flat. "You're being dramatic again." I looked at her, the sister I had helped more times than she would ever remember, and for the first time I saw her clearly not as the girl I wanted her to be, but as the girl she had become under years of unconditional indulgence. "Maybe I am," I said softly. "Or maybe I'm finally seeing things the way they are." I walked past them, each step feeling strangely weightless. My mother called after me once more, her voice sharp and cold. "Don't expect us to welcome you back if you leave like this." I didn't turn around. "I'm not asking you to," I said. When I stepped outside, the cool air hit my face, and it felt like the first real breath I'd taken in days. The house behind me seemed smaller somehow, not physically but emotionally, like it no longer held the power it once did. I loaded my suitcase into the trunk of my car and slid into the driver's seat. My hand still trembled, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was momentum, change, the beginning of something I didn't yet understand. As I backed out of the driveway, I caught a glimpse of my mother standing at the window, arms folded tightly across her chest. My father stood behind her, expression unreadable. Emily had already disappeared from sight. I didn't expect any of them to call me back. They were too proud for that, or too certain that I would eventually come crawling home, apologizing for daring to put my own life first. But as I drove away, I knew I wouldn't crawl back. Not this time. Something fundamental had shifted, and there was no undoing it. The road stretched out before me, unfamiliar but open, and I felt the faintest spark of hope flicker beneath the hurt. I didn't know what waited for me on the other side of this decision. I didn't know how the next hours or days would unfold, but I did know one thing with absolute certainty. I didn't know leaving would trigger their downfall. Those words stayed with me as I drove away from my parents' house, the familiar neighbourhood shrinking in my rearview mirror, until it was nothing more than a cluster of shapes and colours. I didn't know what would happen to them, or to me after the door I'd closed so firmly behind me. I only knew that driving away felt like stepping out of a shadow I hadn't realised was so deep. My hand still trembled on the steering wheel, but there was a steadiness growing beneath the shaking. Something that felt like possibility, like oxygen-filling lungs that had learned to survive on too little. I arrived at the interview site earlier than planned, partly because I always did, and partly because leaving home had sped everything in me forward. My pulse was still unsteady when I turned off the car, and for a moment I sat there in the quiet, letting the truth settle. I had walked out on my family. I had stood up for myself. I had chosen my future over someone else's convenience. The realization made my throat tighten in a way I didn't expect. It hurt, yes, but it also felt like growing. The building before me gleamed with tall windows and clean lines, a place where expectations were high and opportunities were real. I had been preparing for this interview for weeks, studying the company's history, reviewing project outlines, rehearsing responses. But nothing had prepared me for the emotional mess I carried into the parking lot that morning. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror and let out a slow breath. My eyes looked tired but determined. My jaw was set, my mind sharper than it had been in days. Strangely, the chaos at home had burned away the fear I had expected to feel today. All that was left was clarity. Inside, the receptionist greeted me warmly and directed me to a waiting area. I smoothed my blazer and sat down, my heartbeat gradually finding its rhythm. By the time my name was called, the tremor in my hands had faded. The events of the morning hadn't weakened me. They had crystallized me. Something inside was firmer, clearer. I wasn't here as the girl who always gave in. I was here as a woman who had finally taken ownership of her life. The interview panel consisted of 3 people, all of them attentive, professional, and curious. They asked about my past projects, my management style, my approach to solving unexpected problems. I spoke with a confidence I didn't know I had in me. Not arrogance, just steadiness, realness. Every answer came from a place inside me that had spent years quietly doing the work, learning, growing, pushing forward, while no one at home cared enough to ask how or why. At one point, one of the interviewers leaned back and said, "Your portfolio is impressive, but what stands out most is your ability to stay composed under pressure. Where does that come from?" I gave a small smile, the kind that hides a lifetime of stories. "Experience," I said, "learning when to bend and when not to, learning what truly matters." They nodded, satisfied. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. The truth was written in ways they couldn't see in every moment I had swallowed my own needs, in every quiet sacrifice, in every time I had been expected to hold myself together while others unraveled. All that pressure had shaped me, but it hadn't broken me. It had prepared me. By the time the interview ended, the panelists were smiling. One shook my hand with extra warmth. Another told me they appreciated how clearly I communicated. They said they would be in touch soon. I thanked them, stepped out of the building, and felt the sun on my face, a small steadying warmth after a long, cold morning. I drove home to my apartment with a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. My body was tired, my shoulders heavy, but my spirit felt like it had finally found space to breathe. When I walked inside, the silence of my own living room felt comforting. No raised voices, no accusations, no expectations hanging in the air. I set my suitcase down and let the quiet wash over me. The next day, just before noon, my phone rang. It was the company's number. For a moment, my breath caught. I answered as calmly as I could, but my heart was racing. The hiring manager's voice was bright, almost cheerful. "Jennifer," she said, "we'd like to offer you the project leadership position." I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of emotion rise and settle in my chest. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I'm honoured." She explained the details, salary, benefits, the timeline for onboarding. Everything sounded solid, promising, like the kind of opportunity I had dreamed about, but rarely allowed myself to picture clearly. When the call ended, I sat there for a while, my phone resting in my lap, and let the truth sink in. I had done it. Even after the chaos of the last day, even after years of feeling underestimated, I had stepped forward and claimed something for myself. Quietly, privately, without fanfare, but it was mine. Later that afternoon, as I made myself a small meal, my phone buzzed again, this time with a message from my aunt. The aunt who had always seen me, always understood me in ways my parents never tried to. I opened the message and found a single line: "You matter more than you know." I sat down, my eyes stinging. She didn't know what had happened at my parents' house. She didn't know how deeply her words would land, but somehow she always reached me when I needed it most. Her message felt like a hand on my shoulder, steady and gentle, telling me I wasn't wrong for choosing myself. For a few days, I focused on my new role, preparing documents, organising my workspace, and easing into the life I hoped to build from here. Things felt stable, even hopeful. But peace doesn't last forever, not in stories like mine, and certainly not in families like mine. Then news from home started reaching me. At first, I didn't think much of it. When I walked away from my parents' house, I expected silence, maybe anger, maybe cold disapproval, but not actual news. I thought they would simply pretend I hadn't left, the same way they pretended my needs had never existed. But that wasn't what happened. The separation I created opened a crack in the pattern of our family, and through that crack, things began to slide. Not all at once, and not loudly, but slowly, steadily, like a quiet unravelling I could feel even from miles away. I had been settling into my new role, trying to keep my mind on the software project they had assigned me. My days were full of meetings, onboarding sessions, schedules, and tasks that demanded my attention. I didn't have the emotional space to think about the house I left behind, at least not in the beginning. But one afternoon, while I was reviewing contracts at my kitchen table, my phone lit up with a message from a number I didn't recognise. The area code was familiar, my hometown. I hesitated before opening it already, sensing the weight behind the unexpected contact. It was from one of my father's co-workers, a man I barely remembered but had met once years ago. His message was brief, polite, almost apologetic. He said he hoped I was doing well, and then added that he had heard my father's hours were being cut at work because the company had lost a major client. He didn't know if my father had told me. He thought I should be aware. I stared at the message for a long time, not sure how to feel. Concern came first because whatever had happened between us, he was still my father. But behind that concern was something quieter, something I didn't fully understand yet. A sense of distance, a sense of clarity. My father losing hours at work wasn't caused by me. I knew that logically, but the timing made everything feel tangled in ways I couldn't ignore. A few days later, my aunt called. She had heard what happened at the house and didn't want to overwhelm me, but felt I should know that my mother's health had taken a turn. Nothing sudden or dramatic, just the gradual worsening of the issues she'd been hinting at for months. Her insurance covered part of it, but not enough. They were struggling to keep up with the co-pays. I felt a tightness in my chest as my aunt spoke, her voice soft with concern, not just for my mother, but for me, knowing how complicated my feelings were. I listened, grateful she was the one telling me and not my parents. If they had called, their words would have been tangled with blame or expectation. But my aunt simply told me the truth. She didn't ask me to come home. She didn't urge me to fix anything. She just wanted me to know. After we hung up, I sat on my couch and let the silence wrap around me. I cared about my mother, I always had, but caring didn't erase the hurt or the reality that stepping back had been the right choice. I felt torn between the daughter I had been raised to be and the woman I was learning to become. But staying entangled in their demands wouldn't heal anyone, least of all me. Then came the message about Emily. This one came through social media, from a mutual acquaintance, someone who knew Emily through school and remembered I was her sister. The girl wrote that Emily had been frantically posting online about bank issues and credit trouble. Apparently, she had signed up for several store cards and missed the payments. The interest piled up quickly, and she was now facing overdraft fees and overdue notices. She had even tried to claim one of the charges wasn't hers, but the store had records showing otherwise. My first reaction was exhaustion, not surprise. Emily had always lived as if consequences were something other people had to deal with. My parents had shielded her from responsibility so often that she couldn't recognize her own role in her problems. It was almost predictable that her first crisis would arrive the moment I wasn't there to quietly fix things behind the scenes. Still, a part of me felt something that resembled sadness, not because of her situation, but because she had been raised to fail. My parents had wrapped her in so much praise and so few boundaries that she had grown into someone fragile in all the wrong ways. I wasn't happy she was struggling, but I wasn't surprised either. As the days passed, the messages continued. A neighbour texted me. A childhood friend reached out. Each one carried a new piece of the puzzle. My father was working half the hours he used to. My mother was exhausted, struggling to juggle bills and appointments. Emily was panicking about her finances, blaming everyone except herself. And, through all of it, not one of them called to check on me, apologise, or even acknowledge the way things had ended. What struck me most wasn't the downfall itself, it was how quickly people outside the family noticed what was happening. It was as if the moment I stepped out of the role they had built for me, the quiet balancing act I'd been performing for years began to unravel, revealing the underlying instability that had been there all along. Without someone holding everything together, the cracks my family ignored finally widened. I kept my distance, not out of revenge, not out of spite, but because I needed to learn how to stay whole without returning to old patterns. The part of me that used to rush in and fix everything was still there. But she was quieter now, tired and wiser. I knew if I went back too soon, nothing would change. They would lean on me again, expect me to sacrifice again, and I would fall into the familiar trap of patching holes in a ship that had never been mine to steer. My phone began ringing more often. Unknown numbers. The house phone I hadn't heard in years. My mother's cell. My father's work line. Even Emily's number flashing across my screen. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew that caring wasn't enough to go back to a life where I disappeared in order to keep peace. I silenced the phone and set it face down on the table, feeling the weight of the choice settle inside me. It wasn't easy. It wasn't heartless. It was necessary. They kept calling, but I didn't answer. I remember sitting there on my couch after silencing my phone, feeling the vibration of each missed call through the cushions as if the house itself were pulsing with a past I was trying so hard to step away from. I wasn't ignoring them out of anger. If anything, my heart clenched each time their number flashed across the screen. But I knew myself well enough to understand that if I picked up too soon, if I let their voices seep into my resolve, I might fall right back into the pattern that had shaped my life for 36 years. I might bend again. I might apologize for wanting more than the narrow space they allowed me, and I wasn't ready to lose the progress I had made. Still, the silence I chose came with its own weight. My job was going well, and each day at work grounded me more firmly in the life I was trying to build. I felt respected in ways that felt new and startling. My opinion mattered, my decisions carried weight, and the people around me listened when I spoke. That sense of value steadied me as the calls from home grew more frequent and more desperate. Yet, beneath all that newfound strength, there was an ache that didn't go away, a quiet sadness for the family I still loved, even when loving them hurt. At first, the messages from my parents were short and stern. My father had left voicemails with clipped tones saying things like, "Call us back. We need to talk," as if I were an employee who had missed a shift. My mother's texts were longer but no softer. She wrote that she was disappointed that a good daughter would come home, that families stuck together. None of the messages mentioned what had happened in the kitchen. None acknowledged the shove, the hurt, or the reason I left. Then the tone shifted. The messages sharpened into guilt. My father said I was abandoning them when they needed me. My mother wrote that she couldn't sleep, that my absence was breaking her heart. Emily sent a single text that read, "You're being selfish again," followed by another saying, she couldn't believe I was leaving them to deal with everything alone. There were no details, no explanations, just pressure worded differently each time. The same old pattern, only louder now that I was no longer there to shoulder the burden quietly. But a few days later, their messages shifted again this time, in a direction that made my stomach twist. The guilt turned into pleading. My mother said the bills were piling up, that she had missed another appointment, because she didn't have the energy to drive herself. My father said they were drowning and needed help. Emily's tone changed most dramatically. Gone was the sharpness. She wrote late one night, "Please, Jen, I messed up. I need you. I don't know what to do." That message made my throat tighten because for the first time, it almost sounded honest. And yet, something held me back from answering. I treasured my aunt's quiet support during that time. She called me regularly not to tell me what to do, but simply to check on me. She asked how work was going, how I was settling into the new role, how I was feeling. When I told her bits and pieces about the calls from home, she listened without pushing. She didn't judge me for keeping my distance. She didn't tell me to rush back and fix things. She simply said, "Take your time. Make sure the choice comes from strength, not obligation." Those words stayed with me. Obligation had ruled my entire life. Strength had only just begun to take shape. But despite the past hurt, despite the anger, I was still learning to process the truth, was that I did care. I cared too much sometimes. And every call, every message, every "please call us back" pulled at the part of me that still saw them as family, even if they didn't always treat me like a daughter. I didn't want them to suffer. I didn't wish hardship on them. But I also knew that rushing in to rescue them would erase everything I had just begun to build within myself. The pressure grew heavier by the day. At work, I tried to focus on my projects, absorbing myself in tasks that demanded precision and clarity. In meetings, I found small moments of pride in how well I performed. My supervisor even complimented my leadership potential during a team call, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel proud without shrinking. But during breaks, I would see missed calls piling up and my heart would stumble. I wanted to help, but I didn't want to lose myself again. One Friday evening, after a long week of juggling work and the emotional weight of unanswered messages, I sat alone in my apartment with my phone resting on the table. I kept staring at the screen, feeling torn between two worlds, the one I had finally stepped into and the one that was still pulling at the edges of my heart. I knew I couldn't go back, not the way I had before, but I also knew I couldn't ignore the situation forever. I picked up the phone and scrolled through the long chain of missed calls, rereading the most recent message from my mother, Jennifer, please. We need to talk. Things are getting worse. Beneath that was a shorter message from Emily. Please don't leave us like this. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. There was so much they didn't understand about me, so much they never took the time to ask. But they were still my family. And whether I liked it or not, a part of me still wanted them to see me clearly, even if I knew that wish might be impossible. I didn't want to return home. That place didn't feel like home anymore, but maybe meeting them somewhere neutral, somewhere that didn't drag me back into old roles, would let me keep my footing. I needed to speak with them to understand what was happening, to see for myself what shape their lives had taken since I left. Not to fix everything, but to face it. To face them, and to decide for myself how much of my heart I was willing to risk. With a slow breath, I typed a short message: "We can meet. Public place. Tomorrow." I sent it before I could second-guess myself. The moment the message left my phone, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I had opened a door, but not the old one, not the door that led back into their control. I finally agreed to see them, but not to return. Those words stayed with me the next morning as I drove to the small cafe I'd chosen for our meeting. It was neutral territory by design, somewhere quiet enough for conversation, but public enough that emotions couldn't escalate the way they had at home. I wasn't sure what waited for me on the other side of this decision. I only knew that I needed to face them with the same steadiness I'd been building inside myself. I wasn't going back to my old patterns. I wasn't walking into that meeting as the daughter who absorbed everything in silence. I was walking in as a woman who had finally learned her own worth. When I arrived, I saw them immediately. My mother sat stiffly near the window, her hands folded in her lap. My father stared into a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Emily sat between them, tapping her fingers on the table, her posture restless, her eyes darting toward the entrance every few seconds. The moment they spotted me, all movement stopped as if someone had pressed a pause button on their thoughts. Their faces were a mixture of relief, tension, and something else I couldn't quite name. I walked to their table calmly, my shoulders straight, my breath steady. Something about my posture seemed to throw them off. They had expected me to arrive timid, hesitant, maybe even apologetic. Instead, I felt grounded, centered, and they didn't quite know how to respond to that version of me. My mother was the first to speak. "Jennifer," she said, smoothing her blouse as if preparing for company. "We're glad you came." I nodded and took a seat across from them. "You asked to talk? I'm here to listen." My father shifted in his chair, clearly unsettled by my composure. He watched me the way someone watches a stranger they used to know well. "You didn't need to make this so formal," he said. "We're family." The irony of that statement stung, but I didn't let it show. "I thought a public place would keep the conversation civil," I replied. "Last time, things got heated." My mother waved a dismissive hand, as if the memory were an inconvenience. "Your father lost his temper. You know how stress affects him?" "He pushed me," I said gently, not raising my voice. Not accusing, just stating the truth. "That's not something we can gloss over." My father's jaw tightened. "You provoked me." By saying no, I asked, still calm. He didn't answer. For a moment, none of them looked at me. They looked at their hands, at the window, at the table, anywhere but at the truth, sitting plainly between us. Their discomfort didn't hurt me the way I expected it to. Instead, it confirmed how necessary this distance had been. They weren't ready to take responsibility. Maybe they never had been. My mother finally cleared her throat. "Jennifer, we didn't ask you here to argue. We're going through a lot right now." "I know," I said, I heard about Dad's hours being cut. And your health, Mum? And Emily's financial issues? My mother's eyes flicked upward with surprise. So you do care? She whispered almost accusingly. I always cared, I said. I just can't sacrifice myself to fix everything anymore. My father leaned forward, an edge creeping into his voice. We wouldn't need your help if you hadn't walked out. That's not true, I replied. Your hours were cut because the company lost a client. Mum's health issues didn't start the day I left. And Emily's credit problems, well, those have nothing to do with me. Emily flinched slightly at the mention of her finances. She crossed her arms and looked away, her jaw tightening. I noticed the nervous way her leg bounced under the table, a rapid motion she couldn't seem to stop. It was the first crack in her usual confidence. My father scowled. Your sister has been under a lot of pressure. We all have, I said quietly. But I'm not responsible for cleaning up everyone's messes. They didn't like hearing that, but they didn't argue. Not yet. The server approached and asked if I wanted anything. I ordered tea, though my throat felt too tight to drink much. My family remained silent until the server walked away. It was my mother who broke the quiet. We need help, Jennifer, she said, her voice trembling for the first time. We're trying, but everything is slipping at once. Her vulnerability tugged at my heart in a way nothing else had. I took a slow breath. I'm willing to talk about ways I can support you, but not by becoming the person who takes on everything alone. Not anymore. My father scoffed under his breath, but my mother shushed him. Emily still hadn't spoken. She kept her eyes on the table, her fingers picking at a napkin until it frayed along the edges. Then, almost as if she couldn't hold it in anymore, she blurted, Did you tell your job what happened? I blinked. No. Why? She swallowed, her throat bobbing in a nervous motion. I was wondering. Her eyes didn't meet mine. Her voice didn't sound like the usual confident Emily, who believed the world revolved around her desires. There was something shaky underneath something she didn't want exposed. A thought flickered through my mind, then quiet at first, but persistent. Emily didn't usually care about my workplace. She never asked about my job unless she wanted something. This question wasn't casual. It wasn't small talk. It was fear. Real fear. I tilted my head, studying her more closely. Is there a reason I should tell them I asked? Emily's fingers froze. Her shoulders tensed. Her eyes stayed fixed on the napkin she'd shredded into thin strips. My father answered for her. She's just making conversation. Don't overthink everything. But the way Emily's face drained of a colour told me it wasn't conversation. It was worry. Worry tied directly to my job in a way I didn't understand yet. My mother nudged Emily gently. Just tell her, she whispered. Emily shook her head, her hair falling in front of her eyes. She refused to look at me. A knot formed in my stomach, a small, tight warning. Something was wrong. Something they weren't saying, something Emily was terrified would come to light. And whatever it wasn't small. I sat back slowly, my mind racing with the possibility that my sister's fear had a hidden story tied to me, to my workplace, to something deeper than the chaos they had already confessed. I didn't know that fear had a hidden story. That uneasy feeling settled over the table like a thin, invisible fog. I could sense it, Emily's stiff posture, the way she kept avoiding my eyes, the tremor in her fingers, as she pushed the torn napkin into a little pile. Something was wrong. Something she didn't want to say. And, for the first time in my life, I didn't rush to smooth things over, didn't try to soothe her or ease the tension. I simply waited. I had learned that silence used wisely could be far more powerful than pleading. My tea arrived, steaming softly. I lifted the cup more for composure than thirst and looked at each member of my family. They sat there in varying states of discomfort, my mother wringing her fingers, my father growing irritated by the tension he didn't understand, and Emily nearly shrinking into her chair. Let's be direct, I said quietly. You wanted to meet. You said things were slipping. So tell me what you expect from me. My father straightened, relieved to move back into familiar territory control. "We need help with the bills," he said quickly. "Your mother's appointments, my reduced hours, the house taxes, Emily's situation. You know money is tight." There it was, the request, or rather demand, beneath every unanswered call. My mother reached across the table as though trying to offer softness. "It's only temporary," she said, though her voice carried doubt. "Just until we get back on our feet." Emily finally looked up. Her eyes were watery, but her expression held something sharper. "You owe us that much." Her words hit the air like a slap. The old Jennifer would have swallowed the sting, apologized for not doing more, and quietly rearranged her life to fix hers. But that version of me was gone. I set my cup down slowly. "I don't owe you," I said, my voice steady. "Not like that." All three of them froze. Shock flickered across their faces, pure disbelief. It wasn't anger at first, it was confusion. They didn't know how to react to a version of me that didn't bow her head and say yes. My father leaned forward, jaw tightening. "We are your family. We raised you. We supported you. And now when we're struggling, you won't help." "I'm willing to help," I said, choosing each word carefully. "But not by paying your debts or taking responsibility for your mistakes. I won't carry the entire load anymore." My mother's voice trembled. "Jennifer, that's cruel." "It's honest," I replied. Emily dropped the torn napkin, her voice rising with desperation. "You don't understand. Everything is falling apart. I have late fees and notices, and I can't deal with this alone." "You're an adult," I said. "You'll have to." Her face twisted. "Easy for you to say. You always get everything right." I shook my head. "No, Emily. I worked for what I have." My father slammed his palm on the table hard enough that other customers looked over. "Do not talk to your sister like that. She's been through enough." I didn't raise my voice, but something in me hardened. "She's been protected from consequences. That's not the same as suffering." My mother gasped, softly offended. Emily's cheeks reddened. My father's eyes narrowed in a warning I had obeyed my whole life. But I didn't look away. Not this time. "I love you," I said, and to my surprise, I meant it. "But I'm not going to sacrifice my stability to rescue you from decisions you refuse to face." My father opened his mouth to argue, but I continued. "I will not pay your overdue taxes. I will not cover your missed credit card payments. I will not fix the financial mess Emily created. I won't be used as a safety net you assume will always be there." The shock that crossed their faces was almost painful to witness. But beneath the pain, beneath the bewilderment, a sliver of respect flickered in my own heart. Not from them, within me. For myself. Emily's voice became thin and shaky. "So what? You're just going to sit there in your nice job and watch us drown. If you're drowning," I said gently, "it's because you never learnt to swim." She shot to her feet. "You think you're better than us?" "No," I said calmly. "I think I'm finally equal." My father scoffed loudly, refusing to hear the meaning behind the words. "You've changed, and not in a good way." "I've grown," I said. "There's a difference." For a long moment, no one spoke. My tea cooled. Their coffees sat untouched. A family who had once viewed me as the quiet, dependable daughter now stared at a woman they didn't recognize. Finally, my mother's voice cracked. "Jennifer, we need the money." "I'm sorry," I said softly, "but I'm not giving it." Emily burst out, then the panic finally breaking through her facade. "I wouldn't even be in this mess if they hadn't mixed up the applications at the internship place. They kept saying Jennifer, and I didn't correct them because—" She stopped herself too late. Her eyes widened, her mouth snapped shut, and the colour drained from her face. "What did you say?" I asked, my voice suddenly colder. Emily shook her head quickly. "Nothing. I didn't mean, you didn't correct them because what I pressed. She swallowed her throat, moving visibly. My parents stiffened. Something silent passed between them, something that made my stomach twist. I didn't mean it like that, Emily tried again. They thought I was you at first, and it was easier to let them think. My pulse hammered. Why would they think that? Her eyes darted toward my father, then back to me. Her fingers trembled against the edge of the table. It was only the email, she blurted. They emailed you, but it went to me because I used... She slapped her hand over her mouth as if she could stop the rest from spilling out. Used my name, used my email, used something of mine. A cold, creeping realization slid through me like ice down my spine. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and Emily had just cracked it open. I leaned in slowly, my voice almost a whisper. Emily, what did you do? Her breath came fast and uneven. Her eyes filled with tears, not of guilt, but of fear. That fear was the answer I didn't have yet. But it was the beginning. That slip unraveled a secret scheme, and it did. The moment those words left my mind, I felt something shift inside me like a curtain lifting in a room I had never fully stepped into. The tension around our cafe table thickened. Emily sat frozen, her hand still pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide as though she'd just realised she'd knocked over something fragile and priceless. My parents looked equally startled, but not confused. No, there was recognition in their expressions, a flicker too quick for an untrained eye, but I saw it. They knew something. Maybe they'd known all along. I leaned in slightly, my voice low but controlled. Emily, I said, take your hand away from your mouth. She shook her head. For the first time in a long time, my sister looked genuinely afraid. Not annoyed, not offended, not entitled. Afraid. Her fingers trembled as they slowly dropped to the table, revealing lips pressed into a thin, anxious line. What email, I asked? What internship? What used my name? My father cleared his throat. Jennifer, your sister didn't mean... No, I interrupted, turning sharply toward him. She did mean it, and I want the truth. All of it. Emily's shoulders dropped in defeat. She stared down at the shredded napkin as if the pieces might offer her an escape. It was months ago, she whispered, before your interview, before everything happened. What was months ago, I pressed. She swallowed hard. The internship at Larchmont Design. My breath caught. Larchmont Design was a respected firm in the region, a place I had admired early in my own career. What about it? They opened applications, but they wanted people with experience, she said, voice shaking. I didn't have that. Not really, but I knew you did. And I thought, it wouldn't hurt if I just put your name down at first, just to get their attention. I stared at her stunned, not because she'd done it, but because of how casually she confessed, like she was admitting to borrowing a sweater without asking. You used my name? She nodded once, barely lifting her head. And your resume? Kind of. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs. Kind of, Emily. Which part of my resume did you use? Most of it, she breathed. The parts that looked good. The room seemed to tilt. You impersonated me. No, she said quickly as if trying to soften it. Not fully. I just submitted it under your name because I knew they'd open the email. I was going to tell them the truth later. But then they emailed back asking for scheduling, and I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I felt heat rising in my chest, not fiery, but cold, sharp. What did you do, Emily? She hesitated, then whispered. I deleted the email. You deleted it, I said, almost breathless. An email addressed to me, about an opportunity meant for me. She nodded slowly. I didn't want you to see it. The betrayal pulsed through me, steady and bitter. My parents watched me closely. My mother wringing her hands. My father stiffening as though bracing for impact. That's not all, Emily added, barely audible. I closed my eyes for a moment. Part of me didn't want to hear the rest, but I opened them again, steadying myself. Go on. She twisted her fingers together. I needed new clothes for the meetings, the ones I thought I'd have after they read the resume. I didn't think I'd actually get called in, but I used your store credit card. A cold shiver ran through me. Which one? Her voice cracked. The department store one. The small one. I knew the limit wasn't high, but I wanted to look the part. I shook my head slowly. You applied for credit under my name? No, she said quickly. I used the card number, the one Mum kept in the drawer with the bills. I thought, you weren't using it. I thought it didn't matter. It mattered. It mattered deeply. My identity, my financial stability, my trust, it all mattered. So you used my resume, my name, and my credit. I said each word precise. And then you hid it. She looked ready to cry. I didn't think it would fall back on you. How could it not fall back on me, I asked, my voice sharpening despite how desperately I tried to stay calm. Everything you used belonged to me. My father finally spoke, voice tense. It was a mistake. She's young. She didn't know better. She's 25, I snapped. Old enough to know identity fraud is a crime. My mother flinched. Don't say it like that. It wasn't fraud. What would you call it? I asked, staring directly into her eyes. She fell silent. Before any of them could speak again, my phone buzzed on the table. I glanced down and froze when I saw the sender, the human resources director from my new job. A pit opened in my stomach as I unlocked the screen. The message was brief. Jennifer, please call me when you can. We need to clarify something regarding a flagged application associated with your name. My blood went cold. Emily sucked in a breath. Oh, God. I lifted my gaze slowly, dread blooming behind my ribs. What did you do? I didn't mean for it to get that far, she cried. I thought the internship people wouldn't say anything, but then they sent a verification request to your company, and I guess your company forwarded it for an audit or... My father cut her off sharply. Emily. Enough. But it wasn't enough. It was only the beginning. I stared at her, my breath short, my heartbeat a dull hammer in my ears. They flagged my name for potential misrepresentation, I said slowly. Because of you. Emily covered her face, sobbing softly. I didn't think they'd check so deeply. I didn't know your new job would take it seriously. I didn't think. No, she didn't think. She believed the world bent for her. She believed I would always absorb the fallout, no matter how destructive. And my parents had taught her exactly that. My mother reached across the table, voice trembling. Jennifer, you can explain it to your job. They'll understand. How, I asked. What should I say? That my sister stole my identity because my parents raised her to believe she could take anything she wanted. My father clenched his jaw. Watch your tone. No, I said calmly. For once, all of you can watch the truth. Silence fell over the table. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of everything, and yet something else, clarity. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate betrayal. But her plan wasn't the only betrayal hidden from me. Those words echoed in my mind as I stood there in the cafe, staring at the three faces I had once called my family. Emily was crying into her hands. My mother looked shaken but defensive. And my father, he just stared back at me, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold with something that felt uncomfortably close to calculation. I had learned to read that expression over the years, the one that said he was thinking, adjusting, preparing to defend whatever wrong he believed he had the right to commit. I felt a chill tighten across my shoulders. If Emily had used my name and credit without my permission, how far back did these choices go? What else had they quietly taken because they assumed they could? My phone buzzed again, another message from my employer asking for a call. The urgency in the wording sent a cold shiver down my spine. I put the phone face down on the table, suddenly afraid of what might come next. My voice was quiet when I spoke again. Is there anything else I should know? My father shifted in his chair and I noticed the subtle stiffening of his shoulders, the way his hand closed into a fist on the table. That reaction alone told me he knew something bigger than Emily's carelessness. My mother glanced at him nervously, as if silently urging him to stay calm. Jennifer, he said at last, don't start digging for things that aren't there. The tone wasn't defensive, it was warning, and I didn't obey warnings anymore. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice steady despite the ache rising in my throat. His eyes hardened. "Nothing that concerns you." That answer sent a sharp jolt through me. If it didn't concern me, he wouldn't have said it like that. My mother reached for his arm, but he shook her off. Emily lifted her tear-streaked face, confused, as if she was hearing this tone from him for the first time. I exhaled slowly. "Dad," I said, "if there's something involving my name, my information or my finances, you need to tell me now." He didn't answer. His silence was heavy, too heavy. It wasn't guilt, it was a battle inside him, a tug of war between the instinct to cover himself and the realization that things had already gone too far. My mother looked down at the tablecloth and whispered, barely audible, "She'll find out anyway." My father shot her a sharp look, but the damage was already done. My stomach dropped. "What will I find out?" I pressed. My father's jaw twitched. He finally said, "Years ago, I needed a small loan for home repairs. It wasn't a big deal. The bank required a cosigner." I frowned. "Okay, so who did you use?" He didn't answer. My breath faltered. "Who?" He looked up at me with a kind of defiant resignation. "You." It felt like the floor tilted beneath me. "Me?" I repeated. "You used me as a cosigner." He crossed his arms. "You were my daughter. It's normal for family to help." I stared at him in disbelief. "I was 22. You didn't even ask me." My mother whispered, "You were busy with work, and we didn't think you'd mind." My voice rose, breaking slightly. "You used my social security number without my permission." My father slammed his hand on the table. It kept the house standing. The cafe grew quiet around us, other customers turning to look. My mother reached for his hand again, trying to calm him, but he yanked it away. Emily sat frozen, absorbing the revelation with wide, stunned eyes. "How long have you known this would come back to me?" I asked. He didn't deny it this time. "The loan wasn't paid off," he said. "I had to reduce my hours. Things got tight. I meant to catch up on the payments." I felt a cold tightening in my chest. "How behind is it?" His silence gave me the answer before he spoke. "Over a year." My breath left my lungs in a hard, painful rush. "You put my name on a delinquent loan," I said quietly. "A loan I didn't even know existed." He shrugged as if my pain were an overreaction. "You have good credit. You'll recover." I could barely see straight. "Dad, if that goes to collections, they come after me. Not you. Me." He looked annoyed at my emphasis. "You have a good job now. You'll figure it out." That sentence, so casual, so entitled, so dismissive, cut deeper than anything he'd said that morning in the kitchen when he'd shoved me against the wall. Because this wasn't anger. This wasn't heat. This was cold, deliberate exploitation wrapped in the language of parental obligation. My father hadn't just leaned on me. He had used me, quietly, willingly, without remorse. My mother reached out as if to console me. "Jennifer, sweetheart, your father didn't mean any harm. He stole my identity," I said softly. "He put me in debt I didn't agree to. And now, there's an overdue loan attached to my name." My father let out an exasperated sigh. "It was just a piece of paper. Don't be dramatic." Emily flinched at that word. Dramatic. The same word she'd thrown at me in the kitchen. The same word they'd all used to minimize my feelings my entire life. But this wasn't drama. This was violation. I felt my hands shaking. Not with fear, but with clarity. Sharp, unyielding clarity. They hadn't just neglected me. They hadn't just dismissed me. They had taken from me, used me, exploited the parts of me they assumed would always bend. And now, their mistakes were threatening the life I had fought to build for myself. I stood slowly. My chair scraped softly against the floor. My mother looked up at me with pleading eyes. My father's jaw locked as if bracing for my reaction. Emily whispered, "Jen, I didn't know they—" But I held up a hand. I couldn't take in her voice, not yet. I inhaled deeply, steadying myself. "I'm going to fix what I can," I said quietly. "But not for you, for me. Because it's my name on the line. My credit, my reputation." My father scoffed, still refusing to accept responsibility. "You're overreacting," my mother whispered. "Please don't walk away again." I looked at them, not with anger, but with truth. "I'm not walking away," I said. "I'm stepping out of the role you built for me. And I'm not stepping back in." Their faces fell, but I had nothing left to give them. I picked up my purse, my phone, and my resolve. As I stepped away from the table, my father muttered under his breath, "We're your family. You owe us." I didn't turn around. I didn't need to, because now I knew the truth. I owed them nothing, and that wasn't the last surprise awaiting me. Those words stayed with me long after I walked out of the cafe, my pulse still unsteady and my breath uneven. I wasn't just shaken, I was hollowed out. The truth about my father's loan, the truth about Emily's identity fraud, the truth about years of quiet exploitation. It all clung to me like a cold shadow. I sat in my car for several minutes before I could even turn the key. My family had crossed lines I hadn't even imagined existed, and they had done it with the kind of casual entitlement that told me they had never really seen me as my own person, only as a resource, someone dependable, pliable, endlessly forgiving. But the world around them wasn't as blind as they hoped. In the days that followed, word began to move through the small community where they lived, the neighbourhood streets, where people trimmed their lawns on Saturday mornings, where holiday lights went up early, where gossip travelled faster than mail. I didn't start the rumours, I didn't even fan them. But truth has a way of rising when people have watched quietly for years. The first call came from Miss Hanley, the elderly Nahiba who used to bring us pies on Thanksgiving. She had found me through my aunt when she realised I wasn't living at home anymore. Her voice, warm and trembling, carried the weight of years of observation. "Jennifer dear," she said, "I heard what happened. I always wondered how you managed so much on your own. You were the only one mowing the lawn after your father's surgery. The only one driving your mother to appointments. The only one working through college while your sister stayed home." My throat tightened. I didn't correct her. I didn't try to protect my family's image the way I once would have. She already knew the truth. Maybe she had known it long before I did. Another neighbour reached out later that week, this time, through social media. She apologised for intruding, but said she'd overheard my parents arguing on their front porch, my father complaining loudly that I had abandoned them right when we needed her money. The neighbour wrote, "I didn't want to get involved, but it wasn't right hearing them talk about you that way when you've supported them for so long." Supported them, not helped them now and then, supported them. As messages trickled in, I realised just how many people had noticed the imbalance in my family over the years. They had watched me drive my sister to school when she refused to wake up on time. They'd seen me working double shifts during summers, while Emily lounged at the community pool with friends. They'd seen me bring groceries home when my parents struggled financially, even though none of them ever acknowledged where the bags came from. People talk. People remember. And people had been connecting dots silently for a long time. Soon enough, the whispers around the neighbourhood grew louder. My aunt told me that women from my mother's church had begun asking subtle but pointed questions. Why did Jennifer move out so suddenly? Why hasn't she visited? I heard something happened. Did you mistreat her? Is it true Jennifer paid your bills for years? My mother hated being questioned. She always prided herself on looking put together, gracious, respected. But the cracks in her composure showed quickly. According to my aunt, she tried to brush everything off at first, claiming I'd overreacted or misunderstood. But the women didn't buy it. They had seen too many things over too many years. The pharmacist in town mentioned that my mother came in upset one afternoon because someone had asked why Emily was charging so many things while I was the one paying the balances. My mother reportedly snapped at him, stormed out, and later tried to claim he'd misheard. But by then the story had already spread. My father didn't fare any better. At his job, people had begun noticing his outbursts at work and the tension he carried on his shoulders. Then someone asked him loudly in front of others why he had used his daughter's social security number on a loan application. The question didn't come out of nowhere. One of the bank employees lived in town. My father had apparently tried to deflect, but the damage was immediate. He had always prided himself on being respected among his peers, the man others came to for advice, the man with a firm handshake. But now, he couldn't enter the break room without people falling silent or exchanging subtle glances. And Emily, her social circle was the smallest but most vicious. The moment word got out that she had used her sister's identity for credit purposes, the same friends, who cheered her on in everything, suddenly turned cold. One girl posted online about adult responsibilities and borrowing someone's identity, and though she didn't name Emily directly, everyone knew who she meant. Another tagged me in a private message saying, "You deserve better. She's been out of control for years. I'm sorry you had to deal with this." I didn't respond. I didn't trust myself to say anything without anger colouring every word. My aunt told me that my family had become a topic of quiet conversation among neighbours on evening walks in grocery store aisles in line at the local cafe. People weren't cruel, they were shocked. Shocked at the extent of what my family had taken from me. Shocked at how calmly they had expected me to return and fix everything. Shocked that the daughter they had overlooked, criticised and pushed aside had been the one propping them up all along. I didn't feed the rumours. I didn't even correct or clarify them. I stayed quiet. That silence was its own kind of power, one my family had never expected me to possess. Because every time they tried to spin the story in their favour, someone else gently reminded them of the dozens of times they'd seen me doing the work while my family reaped the benefits. The truth had always been there. People simply hadn't voiced it until now. Their downfall wasn't just financial anymore. It was social. Everyone they had once impressed, lectured or tried to impress began to turn away, slowly, subtly, but unmistakably. They weren't viewed as the hard-working, devoted parents they claimed to be. They were viewed as people who had leaned on their eldest daughter until she broke and then blamed her for walking away. And as those whispers grew louder, I found myself feeling something unexpected relief. Not joy, not revenge, just the quiet validation of being seen, maybe for the first time by someone other than myself. But Emily's biggest downfall was still ahead. I didn't realise how soon ahead would arrive. After days of whispered judgment slipping through the community like a cold draft after the truth of my family's treatment of me began surfacing, in places they never thought it would reach, the world around them was already shifting. But none of those consequences touched Emily the way this next one did. Until now, she had been shaken, embarrassed, even frightened, but still suspended above the full weight of her actions, as if her parents' protection might somehow catch her before she fell. But no one could catch her from this. My aunt called early that morning, her voice soft but alert. "Jennifer, I thought you should know. Emily has an interview today. A big one. A company downtown. She's trying to start over. Start over." The words were heavy, hopeful, and heartbreaking all at once. I didn't wish her failure. I didn't wish her misery. But I couldn't wish her success built on lies or shortcuts either. Not again. "I hope it goes well," I said simply because I didn't know what else to say. All morning as I worked through the steady rhythm of my new job, I wondered what Emily looked like preparing for an interview, if she was nervous, if she was determined, if she was scared of being seen for who she really was now that the mask had cracked. For once, she wasn't the golden child gliding effortlessly above consequences. She was a young woman facing a professional world that didn't bend for her, a world that required integrity she hadn't practiced. I pushed the thoughts aside and focused on my tasks. My team relied on me. I had earned this role, and I wasn't going to let old memories pull me off track. But around mid-afternoon, my phone vibrated. It was my aunt. Jennifer, she said as soon as I answered something happened. A chill crawled down my spine. What is it? There was a long pause, followed by a shaky breath. Emily didn't get the job. They didn't even interview her. I gripped the edge of my desk. Did she freeze? Did she walk out? No, my aunt said. They rejected her before she sat down. My stomach dropped. Why? Her next words came slowly, heavy as stones. Because they discovered what she did. The identity fraud, the credit misuse, the flagged applications under your name. All of it. I closed my eyes, hearing my pulse in my ears. My aunt explained what happened as though she were replaying a tragedy she couldn't stop watching. Emily arrived early, dressed in a crisp new blouse. She could barely afford hair-curled makeup, carefully done as if the right presentation could mask the panic beneath. She checked in with the receptionist, sat down in the waiting area and tried to steady her breathing. But before she could be called in, a manager approached her with a strange, tight expression. He asked her to follow him not to an interview room, but to a small private office. Inside, he closed the door gently and sat across from her. He didn't accuse her harshly. He didn't shame her. He simply explained that during their routine pre-interview screening, several serious issues had appeared under her name. Fraudulent activity tied to a legally protected identity. A flagged complaint from the internship program she attempted to impersonate me for. A credit misuse alert from the department store card she had used without permission. And most damning, the pending audit notice connected to my workplace triggered by her previous use of my information. My aunt said Emily froze, staring at him as if he was speaking another language. She kept shaking her head, whispering no, 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 under her breath. He continued gently but firmly, explaining that because of these integrity concerns, the company could not move forward with her application. It wasn't personal. He said it was policy. That was when she broke. She sobbed, my aunt said. Not cried, sobbed. She begged him for another chance, said it was all a misunderstanding, said she was trying to change. But they had made their decision. He walked her out of the building. She collapsed in the parking lot. My mother had to drive over to get her because she couldn't even hold her keys. I didn't speak. I stood at the window in my apartment watching people walk dogs, carry groceries, live normal lives, completely unaware of the storm striking my family a few towns away. My aunt spoke again, her voice trembling. Jennifer, she said she ruined her life. She kept repeating it. I ruined everything. I ruined my life. I swallowed hard. I'm sorry she's hurting, I said quietly. But this is the result of her choices. I know, my aunt said, but it's the first time she's ever had to face them. After the call ended, I walked slowly back to my desk, my chest tight with a mix of emotions. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindictive. What I felt was something harder to name: relief, tangled with grief, sorrow, tangled with justice. Emily wasn't just punished. She was confronted with the truth she had spent her entire life avoiding. She had sabotaged herself. And in doing so, she had finally run into a consequence she couldn't shift onto me. Later that evening, my aunt called again. She spoke softly, almost as if afraid of waking someone. She's been crying all day, she said. Your mother tried to console her, but she doesn't know how. Your father is angry at the company, at the world, at anyone except himself. I listened quietly. My aunt continued. Emily said something I think you should hear. She said, I thought Jennifer would save me. She always did before. The words hit me like a slow, sinking weight. Even now, after everything, Emily still defined her safety by my willingness to sacrifice myself. That more than anything else revealed how deeply she misunderstood what love is supposed to be. I wasn't her shield. I wasn't her excuse. And I wasn't responsible for protecting her from herself. I thanked my aunt for telling me and hung up, sitting in the dim light of my living room, long after the call ended. Emily's collapse wasn't just about losing a job opportunity. It was about losing the fantasy that she could live without accountability, that consequences were meant for other people. And as hard as it was to admit, this collapse might be the one thing that forced her to grow. But even as I tried to process it, even as the night quieted around me, I felt it again, that faint sense of something else lurking beneath the surface. Emily's downfall was not the final secret unravelling in our family. There was something older, something deeper, something that would change everything once it came to light. Yet there was one more truth buried in our family. I didn't know what that truth was, not at first. But I carried that feeling with me over the next few days, like a small stone in my pocket, noticeable, weighted, quietly pulling my attention, no matter how I tried to move forward. I focused on my work, kept myself steady, and checked in with my aunt when she called, but something in the back of my mind kept whispering that there was a piece of the puzzle I hadn't seen yet. A piece that might explain more than I expected, even if it didn't excuse anything that had happened. My aunt finally asked to see me in person. She said it softly in a way that made me pause, as though she were preparing herself for something delicate. So I agreed. We met at a small park near my apartment where old trees arched over the path and the afternoon sun painted the sidewalk in broken patches of light. She walked toward me slowly, her steps thoughtful, her face lined with a mix of worry and something more tender. "Jennifer," she said as we sat down on a bench, "I think there's something you need to know about your father." I looked at her carefully. She wasn't the kind of person who exaggerated or meddled. If she said something was important, it was. "Is it about the loan?" I asked quietly. "No," she said. "It's much older than that. From before you were even born." I waited, letting the gentle breeze rustle the leaves above us. My aunt took a breath before speaking again. "Your father, he had a sister, an older sister. Her name was Caroline." The name meant nothing to me. I had never heard it, not once. "I didn't know he had a sister," I said. "He doesn't talk about her." My aunt replied, her voice low. "Most people don't know she existed. But I think you need to hear her story." She paused, as if layering her words carefully. Caroline was strong, bright, and fiercely independent. She wanted to move away when she turned 18. She'd been accepted into a university across the country. It was her dream. I nodded, picturing a young woman I had never known, someone bold enough to carve her own path. "But your father," my aunt continued, "and your grandparents, they didn't approve. They believed young women should stay close to home. They put pressure on her guilt-fear obligations. They told her she owed the family more than she owed her future." Those words felt too familiar. My chest tightened. "She left anyway," my aunt said softly. She packed a bag and slipped out early one morning. No argument, no goodbye. A chill moved through me. Your father woke up to find her gone. Your grandparents blamed him, said he should have stopped her, said he should have watched her more closely. He carried their anger on his shoulders for years. I sat very still. I could almost see it, my father as a young man standing in a doorway that felt too big and too empty, staring at the space where his sister used to be. "What happened to her?" I whispered. "She built a life," my aunt said. "A good one, I think. But she never came back. The family never heard from her again. Not because she didn't care, but because leaving cost her so much pain that she couldn't bring herself to return to it." I breathed slowly, trying to absorb the way those old wounds still hovered in the air decades later. "Your father carried that loss," my aunt said. "It shaped him in ways he never understood. He told himself he'd never lose someone again, not like that, not by letting them leave." I bowed my head, the weight of her words pressing gently but unmistakably on my heart. "So when you began to make your own choices," she said, "when you started building a life outside that house." He felt that loss all over again. I forced myself to meet her eyes. But what he did to me, pressuring me, controlling me, pushing me against the wall, that wasn't love. "No," she said firmly. "It wasn't. Pain doesn't excuse cruelty. And controlling someone isn't the same as protecting them." I nodded slowly. It was a truth I had needed someone else to say out loud. "Your father's fear made him controlling," she said, "and it made him blind." He repeated the same harm that destroyed his relationship with his sister because he never learned how to break that pattern. But that doesn't make his actions right. It just explains their roots. I felt something sharp inside me soften, not into forgiveness, but into understanding. A sorrow settled in my chest, heavy, but not suffocating. I thought of my father, sitting in that cafe rigid with pride, so sure he was owed something from me. I thought of the man who had shoved me against the wall out of anger and fear. And then I thought of a young boy blamed for the choices of a girl he loved growing into a man who couldn't bear the thought of anyone leaving him again. A part of me felt compassion. A deeper part felt clarity. My whole life, I said quietly, I wondered why he treated me so differently from Emily, why he clung so tightly to me, why every time I tried to step forward he tried to pull me back. My aunt nodded. You reminded him of her, not only in your independence, but in your heart. Caroline was the one who helped their mother with chores, who held the family together, who did the responsible thing, even when she was tired. You inherited that from her, and it terrified him. I closed my eyes, letting the wind brush against my face. So he tried to keep me close. Yes, she said, not realizing he was pushing you away. My throat thickened. He hurt me. I know, she said softly. And you deserve to name that hurt without justifying it. We sat in silence for a long moment. A couple walked by with a stroller. A jogger passed in the distance. The world went on around us, while parts of my own history rearranged themselves into something I could finally understand. I thought of all the years I tried to earn his approval, not realizing his fear had nothing to do with my worth. I thought of how hard he fought to keep control, not seeing that it was control that fractured the family he meant to protect. And I thought of how deep the cycle of hurt must go for him, for Caroline, for all of us in different ways. Understanding didn't erase what he'd done. It didn't make the shove less violent, the loan less illegal, or the words less painful. But it did give the past a shape I could finally see instead of stumbling through blindly. My aunt touched my hand gently. Jennifer, you don't owe him forgiveness. You don't owe him reconciliation. But you do deserve to know the truth, because it explains his behaviour, even if it doesn't excuse it. I nodded, tears gathering quietly behind my eyes. Not hot, angry ones, but soft ones, the kind that come from finally seeing the full picture. He's lost before, she said, and his fear made him believe he needed to hold on tighter. But you're not responsible for filling the void someone else left behind. A long breath escaped me. I didn't realise how much tension I'd been carrying until that moment. So now my aunt continued gently, you get to choose what this knowledge means for your future. Not just how you see him, but how you see yourself in relation to him. I looked out at the trees, their leaves glowing in the late afternoon light. I felt something new growing inside me, not forgiveness, not obligation, but a choice. A choice I had never had before. I have to decide what kind of daughter I want to be, I whispered. And saying it out loud made the road ahead finally unmistakably real. Now I had to choose what kind of daughter I wanted to be. That thought echoed in my mind long after my aunt left the park and I walked home alone beneath the soft evening light. Her words, her gentle telling of my father's past lingered with me like a quiet weight resting on my chest. Not heavy enough to crush me, but steady enough that I couldn't ignore it. I moved through my apartment with slow steps, turning on a lamp here, straightening a book there, all the while trying to understand the pieces of my life that had suddenly shifted into a clearer picture. My father's fear, my family's expectations, my sister's collapse, everything seemed to swirl together in a way that forced me to look inward, not outward. Once I finally sat down, the silence of my apartment wrapped around me with an almost startling gentleness. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to truly feel: stillness. I took a long breath and realised how rare that feeling had been in my life. Most of my years had been spent bracing myself, waiting for the next request, the next crisis, the next expectation I would be asked to shoulder without acknowledgement. I had been the dependable one, the steady one, the responsible one. And somewhere along the way, I had let that role swallow the parts of me that wanted needed or dreamed for myself. Sitting there, I let my thoughts drift back through the earlier chapters of my life, years of small sacrifices that had seemed harmless at the time, years of being told I was strong, capable, independent, as if those traits meant I didn't deserve tenderness or consideration. I remembered childhood mornings when I packed my own lunch while my mother fussed over Emily's hair. I remembered teenage summers spent working extra shifts so my sister could join her friends at the lake. I remembered late nights in college when I stayed awake helping my mother with bills while Emily slept soundly down the hall. None of those moments felt noble when I looked at them now. They felt lonely. It struck me how often I had smiled through things that hurt. How often I excused behaviour that should never have been excused. How often I softened my voice so my father wouldn't raise his. How often I accepted less so Emily could have more. And how quietly I let myself disappear so other people could feel comfortable. For so long I thought being a good daughter meant losing myself, that love meant endurance, that approval required silence. I didn't blame myself for believing that. Children grow up learning the rules of their household, even the unspoken ones, and the rules in ours had been clear. Emily's needs came first. My father's temper came second. My mother's comfort came third. And somewhere far behind those things, so far back, it was almost forgotten, came me. But as I sat there in my apartment, in the home I had built with my own hard work and quiet persistence, I realised that being the good daughter had cost me something I hadn't even noticed, slipping away my peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from silence, but the kind that grows from knowing you have value simply because you exist, not because of what you provide. My aunt's story about Caroline, my father's sister, played again in my mind. A young woman with dreams pushed away for wanting a life beyond her parents' reach. A girl who left quietly carrying wounds no one had ever tended. A girl who never returned. I wondered if she too had once tried to be the good daughter. I wondered if she had sacrificed herself in small ways until one day she couldn't anymore. I felt a strange kinship with her, a woman I had never met, whose name I hadn't even known until a few hours earlier. But unlike Caroline, I didn't want to disappear from my family's story. I didn't want to cut ties out of pain. What I wanted, what I finally understood I needed, was to step into a life that didn't require losing myself in the first place. For years I had assumed peace was something that arrived after conflict resolved. But now I saw it differently. Peace wasn't something that came after. It was something I had to claim, protect, and build with intention. It was a boundary, not a reward. I realised then that I had spent too long looking for peace in places that could never give it to me in my father's approval, my mother's gratitude, my sister's temporary affection. Those things were conditional, fragile, easily shattered. The only peace that would last was the one I created for myself. And to create it, I had to stop apologising for having needs. I had to stop shrinking so others could feel big. I had to stop stepping aside so others could walk forward. I had to stop hoping my family would someday see me clearly when they'd spent my entire life refusing to look. Yet even as these truths settled in my heart, I felt an ache that surprised me. A soft sorrow for the girl I used to be, the one who tried so hard, who worked so quietly, who believed love was something she earned through sacrifice. I wished I could reach back in time and touch at her shoulder, tell her she didn't have to try so hard, tell her her worth wasn't measured in tasks completed or crises managed, tell her she deserved kindness too, but the past couldn't be rewritten. The only thing I could change was the path ahead. I stood up from my couch and walked slowly to the window, looking out at the soft glow of streetlights coming on as the sky deepened into dusk. People walked, their dogs, parents pushed strollers, a couple strolled hand in hand. The world was moving gently, steadily, without judgment or expectation. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a life that felt like that quiet, balanced, and wholly my own. I imagined evenings where I didn't brace for a call, asking for something. I imagined weekends spent doing things I enjoyed, not things I felt obligated to do. I imagined visits with my family where love wasn't tangled with guilt. I imagined saying no without fear of retaliation. I imagined a version of myself who wasn't defined by how much she could endure, and standing there I realised I was ready to let go of the version of myself who had lived her life on other people's terms. I was ready to claim the woman I had worked hard to become confident, capable, and deserving of peace. That choice didn't mean abandoning my family. It didn't mean shutting the door forever. But it did mean speaking honestly. It meant holding boundaries even when they made others uncomfortable. It meant treating myself with the same compassion I had given them for years. I took a long breath, feeling it settle deep in my chest. My peace mattered. My boundaries mattered. My life mattered. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to say so. The truth about my father explained many things, but it didn't erase the hurt or the harm. Understanding wasn't the same as excusing, and love wasn't the same as obligation. I could care about him, about my mother, even about Emily, but I no longer owed them the pieces of myself I had given away so freely for so long. So I walked away from the window steady and clear in a way I hadn't felt in years. I finally knew the kind of daughter I wanted to be, not silent, not sacrificial, not small. I wanted to be the daughter who lived honestly, who stood firmly, who loved without losing herself, who gave without erasing her own needs, who stayed when she chose to stay, not when she felt she couldn't leave. And I knew my next step had to be firm. Those words stayed with me through the evening and into the next morning, as if they were a quiet promise I had made to myself long before I found the courage to say them aloud. When I woke, sunlight slipped through the blinds in soft, gentle stripes, and instead of that familiar heaviness in my chest, I felt something steadier, something like resolve. I hadn't felt that kind of strength in years, not the loud, explosive kind, but the quiet, measured strength of someone stepping into her own worth after a lifetime of giving it away. I moved through my apartment slowly, deliberately, as if each action was a reminder of the woman I was becoming. When I made coffee, I didn't rush. When I sat at my small kitchen table, I didn't brace for my phone to ring. When I looked around my home, I saw it clearly, not as a hiding place or an escape, but as a space I had earned, shaped, and protected. A space that reflected the life I fought for, even if no one else had acknowledged that fight. As I sipped the warm coffee, I thought about my conversation with my aunt. The revelation about my father's past had softened some of the jagged edges around his behaviour, but it hadn't erased the harm. Trauma explained patterns, but it didn't excuse them. I could understand his fear without allowing it to rule my life. I could hold compassion for him without surrendering myself to his control. And most importantly, I could see clearly, now that my role in the family had never been chosen by me. It had been handed to me before I was old enough to understand I had a choice. But I had a choice now. As the morning unfolded, I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was slow, steady, and deeply familiar, like reclaiming a part of myself I had left behind. I thought about all the times I had let guilt direct my decisions, all the times I had stayed silent to keep the peace, all the times I had allowed myself to be used because I feared what would happen if I said no. Those days were over. I set my coffee cup down and leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet truth settle through me like warm light. I deserved a life where guilt wasn't the foundation of every interaction. I deserved love that didn't demand self-erasure. I deserved boundaries, real, solid boundaries that didn't bend every time someone tugged on them. So I began with the simplest and hardest rule: no more guilt. Not for saying no, not for choosing myself, not for refusing to let my family's chaos swallow my life again. I wasn't responsible for their financial mistakes. I wasn't responsible for their reputation. I wasn't responsible for repairing Emily's past or my father's. I wasn't responsible for holding up a household that had treated my support as an unspoken obligation. The second rule came more easily: no more exploitation. I made a silent vow that I would never again let someone use my name, my energy, my credit, or my kindness without permission. That door had closed the moment I discovered what Emily had done, and though she might not have understood how deeply she violated my trust, I understood the importance of protecting myself moving forward. My name was mine. My stability was mine. My life was mine. The third rule took me longer to articulate, but once the words formed in my mind, they felt right. I would love with limits, not blind loyalty. Family love was complicated, tangled in expectations and history. But love without boundaries wasn't love at all. It was surrender. And I had surrendered more than enough of my life to people who had not earned that devotion. I could love my father, but I wouldn't let his fear dictate my choices. I could love my mother, but I wouldn't let her soften the truth when it needed to be spoken. I could love Emily, but I wouldn't sacrifice myself to rescue her from consequences she created. Love didn't mean carrying every burden placed at my feet. Love meant being honest, even when honesty was uncomfortable. With those rules formed clearly in my mind, I felt a sense of grounded calm settle through me. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't panicked. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply acknowledging my own worth, maybe for the first time without hesitation. Later that afternoon, I took a walk through my neighborhood, letting the rhythm of my steps steady my thoughts. The trees lining the sidewalks swayed gently in a cool breeze, and the sound of distant laughter trickled through the air. I watched couples walking hand in hand, children playing in their yards, neighbors waving as they passed each other. I couldn't remember the last time I took a walk simply to be present, without rushing, without thinking 10 steps ahead, without bracing for another crisis. My life for the first time felt like it belonged to me. I thought about my career, the job I had earned on my own, the respect I was beginning to feel from my colleagues. I thought about the friendships I hadn't nurtured enough, because I had always been pulled back into family emergencies. I thought about the hobbies I used to enjoy, but had pushed aside to make room for responsibilities that weren't mine. There was a version of myself I wanted to return to, and a version I wanted to grow into. Someone who could laugh without feeling self-conscious. Someone who could rest without feeling guilty. Someone who could love without being taken advantage of. Someone who could hold boundaries without fear. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pavement, I realized I had already started becoming her. When I returned home, I sat again at my kitchen table, my notebook open in front of me. I wrote down everything I wanted moving forward, not material things, but emotional truths. Peace, balance, respect, stability, authenticity. I wrote down the kind of relationships I wanted, the kind of work I wanted to do, the kind of life I wanted to wake up to each morning. Then I wrote one final sentence at the bottom of the page, letting the ink sink deeply into the fibre of the paper. My life is mine, and I will protect it. Seeing the words in writing felt like sealing a promise. I wasn't the same woman who walked out of my parents' house shaking after my father shoved me. I wasn't the same woman who trembled during that confrontation at the cafe. I wasn't even the same woman who cried quietly in her car after learning the depth of her family's betrayals. I was someone new, someone stronger, someone clearer, someone rooted in her own worth rather than her family's expectations. And with that understanding came a sense of direction, something firm, steady, undeniable. It was time to face my family again. Not to fight, not to collapse, not to surrender, but to speak clearly and calmly about what would come next. For them, for me, for whatever relationship might remain after everything had fallen apart and begun slowly to rebuild. I stood up, feeling the weight of my decision settle into place like a final puzzle piece. And then it was time to make my decision clear. Those words echoed in my mind as I drove toward my parents' house 2 days later. The afternoon sky was pale and overcast, the kind of muted grey that made everything look softer from a distance, though nothing about this visit felt soft to me. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, but inside I felt the quiet firmness of someone who had finally learned her own value. I wasn't going there to argue. I wasn't going there to bend. I wasn't going there to comfort anyone at the expense of myself. I was going to speak plainly, something I'd rarely been allowed to do in that house. When I pulled into the driveway, my parents' aging home looked smaller than I remembered, as if worry had shrunk it over time. The porch light was already on, even though it was still daytime and I could see the faint movement of curtains being pulled aside, someone watching. I stepped out of my car slowly, taking a breath that reached down into my stomach. I had rehearsed what I planned to say over and over, but the moment I walked onto the familiar front steps, I felt the old habits try to return, the instinct to soften myself, to apologise for existing, to brace for disappointment. But I didn't shrink. My mother opened the door before I could knock. Her face was tired, drawn in ways that revealed how heavy the past weeks had been on her. She looked at me as if unsure whether to hug me or apologise or scold me. Instead, she stepped aside, letting me in quietly. My father sat in his usual chair, stiff and guarded. Emily sat on the couch, her eyes downcast. Her hands twisted together as though she were afraid they'd betray her emotions. The air felt thick, brimming with tension and hope and fear all at once. I took a seat not on the couch beside Emily, but in the armchair across from all of them. A deliberate choice, a necessary one. My mother spoke first. "Jennifer," she whispered, "thank you for coming." I nodded. "We need to talk." My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Emily swallowed hard, her eyes flicking up to me with a mix of guilt and dread. I folded my hands in my lap, grounding myself in the calm I had practiced. "I'm here," I began, "because I want clarity between us. I want peace, but that means things cannot continue the way they have." My mother's shoulders slumped slightly, as if she already knew what was coming. "I'm going to set new terms for how we move forward," I said. "Terms that honour my life, my boundaries, and my well-being." My father scoffed under his breath. "Boundaries," he muttered, as if the word tasted bitter. I ignored the comment. I wasn't there to engage in old battles. First, I said, "I'm not paying any of the family's debts. Not yours, not the house's, not Emily's. I work too hard for what I have, and I will not be used financially anymore." My mother's eyes filled instantly. "Jennifer, we're drowning. We just need—" "I'm not abandoning you," I said gently, "but I'm not rescuing you with money. What I can do is help you find real solutions. Programs for reduced medical costs. Debt counsellors, temporary relief assistance. I can guide you toward resources, but I will not pay the debts myself." My father's face reddened. "We raised you. We supported." I raised a hand, calmly but firmly. "You raised me, yes, but you also took from me in ways you never acknowledged. My name, my credit, my time, my trust. I'm not here to rehash the past, but I won't pretend those things didn't happen. We move forward honestly, or we don't move forward at all." He looked stunned, not because he disagreed, but because I had never spoken so directly to him before. He didn't argue, not yet. Second, I continued, "If this house becomes unlivable before finances stabilise, you can stay with me temporarily. But it must be under my rules." My mother blinked. "Your rules?" "Yes," I said. "Respect for my space. No yelling, no guilt, no pressure, no demanding money. You will contribute to chores and you will respect my privacy. If any of those things are broken, the arrangement ends immediately." Silence settled heavy and unmoving. My mother whispered, "We would be grateful. Truly." My father stared at the floor, his pride swallowing whatever he wanted to say. Then I turned to Emily. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the fabric of the couch. Her shoulders hunched inward, her fingers trembling slightly. For the first time in her adult life, she seemed small, not because she had been diminished by anyone else, but because the truth of her actions had finally caught up to her. "Emily," I said softly, "you hurt me, more deeply than I've ever admitted to you. You used my name, my credit, my identity, and because of that, you now have consequences you can't hide from." A tear spilled down her cheek. "I know," she whispered. I know, Jennifer, and I'm so sorry. I hear that I said gently, but an apology isn't enough. You need to take responsibility for rebuilding your own life. She nodded slowly, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. I will, she promised. I don't know how yet, but I will. You'll learn, I said, and I'll help guide you if you want. But I won't fix things for you. I won't co-sign anything. I won't lend you money. I won't let you use me as a shield from your own choices. She let out a shaky breath, but she didn't protest. She understood maybe for the first time. I'm willing, she said quietly. I want to start over the right way. I nodded. Good. Because I'm willing to help you look for jobs that match your skills. I can sit with you while you call the credit company to work out a repayment plan. I can show you how to build a budget and stick to it. But the work has to be yours. She nodded again, this time with more conviction. My father shifted in his seat. You're acting like we're strangers, he muttered. I looked at him steadily. No, I'm acting like a grown woman who refuses to be mistreated anymore. He opened his mouth to argue, but something in my expression must have stopped him. He closed it again, his jaw working as he tried to swallow his pride. This is what moving forward looks like, I said quietly. Honesty, responsibility, respect. My mother reached out, placing a hand over mine. Jennifer, I want to understand. I want to do better. Her voice broke something soft inside me, and I squeezed her hand gently. I believe you, I whispered. I leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. Setting these rules hadn't broken me. It had strengthened me. For the first time in my life, I chose myself without guilt. I chose truth over obligation. I chose healthy love over self-sacrifice. But even with this clarity, even with these new terms laid out calmly and carefully, I could feel the tension shifting across the room. Boundaries, no matter how gently spoken, have a way of unsettling people who benefited from the absence of them. And as I looked at my father, his eyes narrowed, his pride bruised, I realized something important. And the moment I saw my father's jaw tighten, the truth of those words settled over the room like a faint tremor before a storm. My mother's hand was still resting lightly over mine. Emily sat hunched and silent on the couch, but my father, he was a presence all his own. Heavy, defensive, wounded in ways he didn't know how to name. His eyes were fixed on me with the intensity of someone who felt the ground shifting beneath him and couldn't decide whether to fight it or hold on to something before he slipped. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed tightly over his chest. I see what's happening, he said, voice low and strained. You think you can come in here and dictate how this family works now? I met his gaze without flinching. I'm not dictating anything. I'm setting terms for how I will be treated moving forward. His frown deepened. You never used to talk like this. I never used to allow myself to, I replied, keeping my voice steady. He let out a sharp breath somewhere between a scoff and a bitter laugh. You think boundaries make you strong. You think walking away from responsibilities makes you better than us. I shook my head. No, Dad. This isn't about being better. It's about being healthy. About being honest. He pushed up out of his chair as if my calmness offended him. Honest? You want honesty? He pointed toward Emily. Your sister is falling apart. Your mother is sick with worry. I'm working myself into the ground trying to... I interrupted gently but firmly. That's not honesty. That's pressure disguised as concern. His face reddened. You think I'm pressuring you. I know you are, I said, and you've done it my whole life. My mother let out a soft, pleading sound, but I kept my eyes on him. For years, I continued, you taught me that love meant giving up everything for this family, even when it cost me my own peace. The moment I tried to step out of that role, you called me selfish. When I refused one unreasonable request, just one, you shoved me against a wall. You used my name on a loan without asking. You allowed Emily's behaviour because it benefited everyone but me. And now, when I finally draw a boundary, you call it abandonment. His jaw worked, the muscles twitching. Families sacrifice for each other. Yes, I agreed. They do, but sacrifice isn't meant to be demanded, and it certainly isn't meant to be taken by force. He stared at me as if he didn't recognize the woman sitting across from him. And maybe he didn't. The daughter he had raised had always bowed her head, lightened her voice, softened her presence. But I wasn't her anymore, not because I stopped loving them, but because I finally started loving myself too. He turned away for a moment, rubbing the back of his neck, the way he used to when he felt cornered. You don't understand what I've carried, he muttered. I do, I said quietly. Aunt Laura told me about Caroline. His shoulders stiffened. The name hung in the air like a ghost neither of us had ever acknowledged before. He turned back towards me, eyes darker, glazed with memories I couldn't fully see. She left, he said, voice rough. She left and never came back. Do you have any idea what that did to this family? To me, yes, I said. I know it broke you. I know you were blamed for her choices. I know you lost someone you loved because she couldn't survive the pressure they put on her. His eyes flickered, pain, resentment, confusion, all tangled together. But Dad, I continued softly, the answer wasn't to control me the same way they controlled her. You didn't protect me, you smothered me. You didn't keep me close, you kept me scared. And the more you tightened your grip, the more I faded. He swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. I didn't want to lose you. You almost did, I whispered, not because I wanted to leave, but because I had no space to exist around you. He looked at me, then really looked. And for the first time, the anger in his expression cracked enough for something else to show through. Fear. A deep, familiar fear that I recognized from the story my aunt told me. The fear of watching another daughter slip away because he didn't understand how to love her without holding her too tightly. You don't have to lose me, I said, but you can't keep me trapped either. He sat heavily back in his chair as if the fight inside him was starting to slow. I don't know how to do what you're asking, he admitted quietly. Start by respecting my boundaries, I said. Start by seeing me as a whole person, not an extension of your expectations. Start by listening when I say no. He stared at his hands, the breath leaving him in a long, weary sigh. You're different now. I'm stronger, I said. That doesn't mean I love you less. It means I love myself too. My mother wiped at her eyes, nodding slowly, almost imperceptibly. Emily watched silently, absorbing every word with a solemn kind of awe. For a long moment, the room softened, no shouting, no accusations, just the fragile, trembling beginning of truth settling between us. Then my father lifted his head and met my gaze again. His expression had changed, not entirely, not in a dramatic way, but subtly like someone letting go of a fist he'd clenched for too many years. I can't force you, he said, voice low. No, I replied gently. You can't. He let out a slow breath and something in his posture shifted. Not surrender, not defeat, but recognition. The recognition that his daughter wasn't someone he could hold on to by fear or manipulation. That whatever relationship we had from this point on would have to be chosen, not demanded. And then, in the kind of quiet moment I never imagined possible, he did something I never expected. At the time, that moment was only the beginning. My father didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't reach for me or break down or try to reclaim authority. He just sat there looking smaller than I had ever seen him, as if something inside him had finally loosened. For a second, he almost seemed to speak, but the words never came. Instead, he stood, slowly walked toward the front door, and stepped outside without another word. The quiet click of the door closing felt like the soft ending of a chapter I hadn't realized we were finishing. That night, after leaving my parents' house, I returned to my apartment, with thoughts swirling around me like wind. I tried to prepare dinner, but I kept forgetting ingredients. I tried to read, but the words on the page slid past me. My father's face, stubborn, wounded, softened by something like resignation, lingered in my mind. I had always imagined that our final clash would end in anger or distance. I never imagined it would end with him looking unsure, almost fragile, like a man, finally realizing he could no longer hold his family together through force. The next morning was quiet. I woke earlier than usual, the pale light just beginning to reach across my bedroom floor. I made coffee and sat at the small table by the window, trying to let the calmness settle through me. That was when I heard a soft knock, not loud enough to alarm me, just enough to announce someone had been there. When I opened my door, no one stood outside. The hallway was empty, still untouched. But on the floor, leaning gently against the frame, was a folded envelope with my name written on the front in handwriting. I recognized instantly my father's handwriting, strong, slightly slanted, a little uneven, as if he had never learned to write without pressing too hard. My first instinct was hesitation. A letter from him could have been anything: anger, blame, apology, or something muddled between all three. But something inside me urged me to pick it up, not out of obligation, but out of the simple desire to understand. So I lifted it carefully and brought it inside, setting it on the kitchen table, as if it were something delicate. For a long moment, I just looked at it. My father was not a man of letters. He communicated through orders, grunts, criticisms, practical instructions. I had never seen him sit down willingly to write anything personal. He barely signed birthday cards. A letter from him felt impossible. And yet, there it was waiting for me. I finally opened it. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, not from weakness, but from the weight of everything leading to this moment. His handwriting stretched across the page, direct and rough, but there was a steadiness to it that felt new. Jennifer, it began. No, my daughter. No softening, but also no anger, hidden beneath the letters. Just my name, simple and honest. I am not good with words, you know that, but yesterday, something in me broke loose. I saw the look on your face when you spoke about your life, your pain, your needs, and I knew I had to say what I should have said years ago. I felt a tightness form in my throat as I read on. You were right, I did pressure you. I did control you. I did use you. Not because you deserved it, but because I was afraid. Afraid you would leave like Caroline. Afraid that if I let you live your life, I would lose you forever. I told myself I was protecting you, but really I was protecting myself from facing that old wound. His words were clumsy, in places the grammar uneven, but the meaning was heartbreakingly clear. I kept reading. When you drew your boundaries, I felt something I haven't let myself feel in years. Fear, yes, but also respect. You are stronger than I ever knew, stronger than I raised you to be, and that strength is not something I should have tried to break. I exhaled slowly, my fingers brushing lightly over the ink, as if trying to understand the man behind the words. I regret the loan. I regret the anger. I regret raising my hand at you in moments I should not have raised my voice at all. That was not protection. That was me losing control. You did not deserve that. Not then. Not ever. My eyes stung with tears, not from pain, but from the soft shock of hearing something I had waited my whole life to hear. I cannot fix the past. I cannot erase the harm. But I want you to know this. I never stopped loving you, even when I loved you the wrong way. I want to try again, not as a father who commands, but as a man who is learning how to be better. There was a pause in his writing, a small smudge, as if he had lifted the pen and put it down again. You get to choose how close or far you want me. I will respect that. I will learn to sit with that. If you ever decide to let me back into your life in a real way, I will do the work to deserve it. The letter ended simply, I am sorry. Dad. No flourish, no dramatic ending, just the truth, raw, imperfect, and long overdue. I sat there for a long time, the morning sun warming the side of my face, the quiet of my apartment holding the weight of his words. I didn't cry, not in the way I once did, overwhelmed and heartbroken. Instead, the tears came softly, as if something unknotted itself inside me, releasing a pressure I had carried silently for years. I wasn't healed, not completely, and I didn't forgive him instantly. Healing wasn't a switch to flip, and forgiveness wasn't something to be rushed for anyone's comfort, not even mine. But there was something gently transformative in holding that letter, something that reminded me that people could change if they were willing to face their own shadows. This was not redemption. This was not erasure. This was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement was the first step toward any kind of future relationship. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the top drawer of my desk, not to hide it, but to honour it. A reminder of what had been broken and what might with time and intention be rebuilt in a healthier shape. As I stood and looked out the window, watching the sunlight grow brighter across the street, I felt something I hadn't felt in years possibility. A sense that my life was opening in front of me like a path I could finally choose for myself without guilt pressing at my back or fear gripping my steps. And for the first time, I saw my future clearly. That clarity stayed with me the next morning when I walked into the office. It wasn't a grand or dramatic feeling, no triumphant music, no sweeping sense of victory. Instead, it felt like stepping into a room where the furniture had finally been rearranged the right way. Everything fit, everything made sense. I wasn't walking toward my life anymore. I was walking in it. The letter from my father rested safely in the drawer of my bedside table, but its presence was still warm against my thoughts. It hadn't erased the past or magically healed everything between us, but it opened a door toward possibility, toward something gentler, something more honest. And that subtle shift softened something inside me, allowing me to face the world with more openness than I'd felt in years. When I arrived at work, the office buzzed with the familiar hum of printers, morning greetings, and clattering keyboards. Yet something about it felt brighter. Maybe it was me. Maybe I was noticing things I had overlooked before, how the receptionist always greeted me with a sincere smile, how my colleagues nodded respectfully when I passed, how my team looked relieved when I stepped into the conference room, as though my presence steadied the room. We were preparing for a major project briefing with the leadership team, one I had been working on since shortly after my promotion. As I spread out the charts and reports, my team gathered around me with a mixture of nervous energy and trust. Jennifer. One of them said, a younger woman named Chloe, your outline made this way easier to understand. I've been in this department 3 years and nobody gives direction as clearly as you. I felt warmth rise in my chest. We all put the work in, I said. I just organised the pieces. But her expression didn't waver. You make things calm, she said simply. Not everyone can do that. Calm, strong, steady. Those were qualities I had spent most of my life offering to others, often without gratitude in return. Hearing them acknowledged, valued, hit me in a place I hadn't known was still tender. The presentation went smoother than I could have hoped. When I spoke, I felt grounded. Each point flowed naturally, shaped by weeks of research and the quiet confidence that had begun growing in me since I left my parents' house. I saw heads nodding as I explained our strategic rollout. I saw the department director jotting notes with a thoughtful expression. I saw members of the executive team exchange glances as if reassessing what they thought they knew about me. When the meeting ended, the director approached me privately. Jennifer, he said, you have a rare quality. You lead with clarity and empathy. Your team trusts you and you've earned every bit of that trust. Thank you, I said, meaning it with my whole heart. You're on the shortlist for next quarter's recognition program, he continued. I can't promise anything yet, but I wanted you to hear directly from me you're making a difference here. Recognition. Me? It was foreign and familiar all at once. Not because I had never deserved acknowledgement, but because I had never allowed myself to imagine receiving it. As the weeks passed, my workdays filled with steady accomplishments, a successful partnership proposal, positive performance reviews, a new training plan I developed being adopted company-wide. My team began seeking my input on personal career decisions, trusting my insight. That trust humbled me. It reminded me that the qualities my family had taken for granted were in fact strengths in the real world. Outside of work, my life continued to grow in quiet, meaningful ways. I started browsing listings for a home not because I needed to move immediately, but because the idea of creating a space, entirely my own, felt like a promise I deserved to keep. I saved articles about little houses, with bright windows and cozy porches. I imagined rooms filled with colours I loved, not ones chosen to please someone else. I pictured a garden perhaps, or a small reading nook by a window. For once the future felt expansive instead of heavy. I also found myself more present with my aunt, who'd always been the quiet witness to my struggles. We shared coffee on slow weekends, walked around the farmer's market, talked about everything and nothing all at once. She seemed relieved to see me healthier, more grounded, and she never pushed me about my family. She simply let me be. Emily called occasionally, hesitantly at first. She updated me on her job applications, her meetings with a credit counsellor, and the small habits she was trying to build to stay accountable. Each time I listened without carrying her burdens for her, and each time I felt the delicate growth of a new kind of relationship between us, not one built on sacrifice, but mutual respect. My mother sent short messages now and then, gentle in tone. She didn't ask for money or favours anymore. She asked about my day, my work, my well-being. It was a shift so subtle and so overdue that it stung and soothed me at the same time. My father kept his distance as he'd promised, but there was no anger in that distance. Just space I needed, and space he was learning to accept. Through it all, the sense of clarity that had begun in that quiet moment after reading his letter continued to sharpen. I was building a life that reflected who I was, not who others expected me to be. I felt steady, solid, whole. Months passed, gently carrying me through new projects, deeper friendships, and small joys I had once overlooked. And as my confidence grew, so did the recognition of others. One morning, I received an email from the executive office inviting me to a company-wide event, an awards ceremony highlighting exceptional leadership. I didn't think much of it at first. The event was annual and most people attended. But when I arrived at the auditorium and saw my name printed on a reserved seat in the front row, my breath caught in my throat. The ceremony began with speeches, acknowledgements, and applause. And then, toward the end, the department director walked onto the stage with a familiar stack of certificates in his hand. This next award he began goes to someone who exemplifies resilience, integrity, and quiet strength. Someone who leads not through authority, but through presence. Someone who has transformed her team through patience, clarity, and humility. I felt my pulse quicken. Please help me congratulate our Leadership Excellence honoree Jennifer Brooks. Applause filled the room, loud, warm, genuine. My eyes stung as I stood walking toward the stage. For years, I had worked in the background, unseen and unacknowledged. Now people were rising to their feet for me. It felt surreal, grounding and healing all at once. I accepted the certificate and shook the director's hand. Cameras flashed, people smiled. My team cheered from the third row. But as I looked out at the crowd, at the faces turned toward me, at the recognition I had earned entirely on my own terms, something shifted inside me because in the very back row, near the door, I saw a familiar figure standing quietly, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression soft with something like pride and humility woven together. My father. And in that moment, one public moment changed everything. That moment stayed with me long after the applause faded, and my father slipped quietly out the back door of the auditorium. I didn't chase after him. I didn't need to. His being there, unannounced, silent, watching from a distance, was the kind of acknowledgement I had hoped for long before I ever admitted it to myself. And when our eyes met, when he nodded with a mixture of pride and remorse, something inside me settled. Not healed, but settled. Still, I had no idea that this moment would become only the beginning of a much larger shift in my life. About 2 months later, I received an email from the Regional Leadership Council. My project, the same one I had poured myself into during some of the hardest weeks of my personal life, had been nominated for a regional award. I reread the email several times. Part of me still carried that old instinct to shrink, to assume it was a mistake or an exaggeration. But another part of me, the part that had slowly grown stronger since I set my boundaries, lifted her head and said, "You earned this." The ceremony was held at a large conference centre an hour from my home. As I arrived, I saw rows of carefully arranged seats, a bright stage, and people from dozens of organisations milling about in quiet excitement. My team had come to support me. When I walked in, they waved as if I were someone truly worth celebrating. It startled me a little. It also warmed me more than I expected. When the programme began, I listened politely as awards were given for various categories. I wasn't nervous, not in the way I used to be. I felt steady, as if I'd already come through the hardest part of my life and nothing on this stage could shake me. Then the presenter stepped forward with a new envelope. "This year's Regional Project Excellence Award," she said, "recognises someone whose leadership not only elevated her team, but reshaped the workflow of her entire department. Her colleagues describe her as calm, fair, and unwaveringly dedicated." My heart beat once, slowly. She led with clarity during a challenging transition and created a project model now being adopted across multiple branches. Another soft breath. "Please congratulate our winner, Jennifer Brooks." When I stood, the applause was warm and immediate. My team cheered loudly from 3 rows back, and I could feel my cheeks warm as I walked toward the stage. But this time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like I was pretending to be someone worthy. I knew I was. The award was a simple glass plaque with my name etched onto it, but holding it in my hands felt like holding proof that everything I had endured meant something beyond pain. I gave brief remarks thanking my team and acknowledging the long hours we had spent building something meaningful. I kept my voice clear, steady, grateful. After the ceremony, a reporter from a local news channel approached me with a gentle smile. "Ms. Brooks, would you be willing to give a short interview about your project?" I hesitated only long enough to take a breath. "Yes," I said, "I'd be happy to." The interview was simple questions about teamwork, about leadership, about what motivated me to keep going, even during difficult periods. I didn't talk about my family or my past. I didn't need to. My work spoke for itself. 2 evenings later, the segment aired during the local news. I wasn't watching, but my phone lit up with messages. Colleagues congratulated me again. Friends sent screenshots. My aunt called tearful and proud. And, most unexpectedly, neighbours from the street where I grew up reached out, people who had watched me as a quiet girl trailing behind her louder family. One message read, "We always knew you had something special in you. We're so proud." Another, "You carried that family for years, Jennifer. It's good to see the world finally sees you." I hadn't expected such sentiment. I wasn't used to being seen at all. A few days later, I ran to the grocery store after work. I was picking up fruit when I heard my name. "Jennifer." "Is that you?" I turned to see Mrs. Waldron, the elderly neighbour, who lived 3 houses down from my childhood home. She placed a hand on my arm with a bright smile. "I saw you on television. My goodness, you were wonderful. You've done so well for yourself." Before I could answer, another neighbour approached, then another. It seemed like half the block had seen the segment, and every comment held the same tone. Not gossip, not pity, but genuine admiration. My family had always held the spotlight in our neighbourhood, but for all the wrong reasons. Arguments, financial trouble, favouritism, tension that clung to the walls like smoke. But now, people spoke of me as if they were finally seeing the side of the story they had overlooked for years. As I stepped out of the store, more voices called my name. It startled me and touched me in a way I hadn't expected. Then, I saw a familiar car parked across the street. My parents. My mother stepped out first, holding a small shopping bag. She gave me a gentle, uncertain smile. My father followed, hands in his pockets, eyes not quite meeting mine at first. We saw the news, my mother said softly. You were... Wonderful, sweetheart. My father nodded. Not stiffly, not defensively, just quietly. You did good, he said. Real good. Something shifted again. Maybe it was their tone. Maybe it was the absence of excuses or pressure. Maybe it was the simple acknowledgement that my accomplishments were mine and that they respected them. For a moment, the three of us stood in a small, awkward triangle on the sidewalk, not quite a family healed, but something closer to truth than we had ever managed before. In the following weeks, the positive recognition continued. Emails from community groups, invitations to speak at 2 events, a congratulatory card left at my apartment door. For once, I didn't push away the praise. I let myself absorb it, not out of pride, but out of finally understanding I had earned it. And as the days passed, my life began to take on a shape I had never known, steady, calm, full of possibility. I started sketching plans again for a home of my own, a place where I could plant a small garden, a place with soft morning light, a place built on peace, not pressure. Everything I had walked through brought me here not to a grand victory, but to a life that finally felt like mine. And that led to the final image of my journey. I didn't know exactly what that image would look like the night I whispered those words to myself, holding my award plaque in both hands. I only knew that something had shifted permanently inside me. The world felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had. For the first time in my life, I understood not just where I stood, but who I was standing as. Over the next several weeks, that clarity guided me through one of the most meaningful decisions I'd ever made, buying a home of my own. It wasn't extravagant, but it felt perfect. A small, charming house at the end of a quiet street with morning sun that poured through the living room windows, and a yard big enough for a garden if I ever decided to start one. The moment I stepped inside during the viewing, something in my chest loosened. It felt peaceful. It felt safe. It felt like the beginning of the life I had fought so hard to reclaim. When the keys were finally in my hand, I walked through each empty room and let the silence wash over me. For the first time, every choice would be mine. Colours, furniture, the energy I allowed inside these walls. I painted in warm golds and soft creams, chose comfortable pieces that made the rooms feel lived in, not staged. I placed bookshelves near the windows, set fresh flowers beside the kitchen sink, and let myself breathe in the feeling of creating a home that didn't ask me to shrink. As the space slowly came alive, I realised something unexpected. I wanted my family to see this. Not because I needed their approval, not because I wanted them to admire me, but because this home symbolised everything I had found in myself, the self-respect, the boundaries, the courage to step away. Inviting them felt like closing a circle one I had carried open for too many years. So one quiet afternoon, I called my mother. "I'd like to have all of you over for dinner," I said. My voice didn't shake. "If you're open to it." She paused, her breath catching. "Are you sure, honey?" "I am," I said. "I want you to see my home." The evening they arrived, I stood in the doorway as the sun dipped behind the oak tree outside. My mother was the first to walk in. Her eyes widened as she looked around, touching the back of a chair and smiling softly. "Oh, Jennifer, this is beautiful. You've made it feel so warm." Emily came next. She had been working hard to rebuild her life after everything fell apart: therapy sessions, financial counselling, part-time work. She wasn't the same careless girl who once demanded I cancel an interview for her convenience. She smiled at me a little shyly. "Jen, this really does feel like you." Then my father stepped into the doorway. For a moment, he just looked at me. Not with authority, not with disappointment, but with a quiet humility I never expected from him. He nodded. "Thank you for having us," he said. We sat around my dining table, the first table I'd ever bought on my own. I'd made roasted chicken vegetables and warm bread. A simple meal, but one rooted in peace rather than pressure. At first, conversation was cautious. a slow dance of gentle questions and careful answers. But gradually, something eased. My mother asked about my projects at work. Emily shared small victories, how she was sticking to her budget, how she'd handled a difficult situation without running from it. My father listened carefully, chiming in only when he had something thoughtful to add. It struck me then, this was the first time I had sat with my family and not felt invisible. Halfway through the meal, my father cleared his throat. His voice was quiet. "You've built something good here," he said. "A life to be proud of. I'm proud of you." The words didn't heal the past. They didn't erase the pain. But they landed gently without the weight of expectation or guilt. I met his eyes and nodded. "Thank you." After dinner, we moved to the living room. My mother noticed the framed certificate on the wall from the regional award ceremony. She ran her fingers along the frame. "You deserved this," she said. "Truly. And I'm sorry we didn't see your value sooner." I didn't rush to comfort her. I didn't downplay her words. I simply said, "I appreciate you saying that." Emily sat beside me, her voice soft. "I'm sorry too, for everything. I didn't realize how much you carried." "I know," I said, "and I'm glad you're changing." The evening wound down gently. As they prepared to leave, my father paused at the doorway again. He looked at the small home I'd built then, back at me. "I can't fix the past," he said quietly, "but I want to do better. I'm learning." "I see that," I replied, "and I'm grateful for the effort." When the door closed behind them, I stood alone in the warm, quiet glow of my new home. The house felt full not of people, but of a deep, steady peace. I walked through the rooms I had built with my own strength, the life I had shaped on my own terms, and I felt a kind of grounding I had never known before. For years I believed justice meant fighting back, proving myself, winning some dramatic battle. But standing there surrounded by the life I chose, I finally understood I didn't seek revenge. I simply stood up, fully, quietly, completely. And in doing so, they finally saw me. I turned off the last light and stood in the doorway, the night air drifting in through the open screen. My heart felt steady, my future felt wide, and that was the day I took my life back. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. When I reflect on everything Jennifer endured and everything she carefully rebuilt piece by piece, I'm reminded of how many people move through life carrying quiet battles no one else sees. Some of you may have felt echoes of your own story in her long struggle to speak up, in her years of giving without being seen, or in that moment when she finally chose herself. And maybe, like Jennifer, you've discovered that change doesn't begin with a dramatic gesture. It begins the instant you decide your voice matters, even if it trembles. Before you leave, I would truly love to hear your thoughts. Was there a moment in Jennifer's story that stayed with you? Something she said or felt that reminded you of your own family, your boundaries, or the strength you didn't know you had? Your reflections and experiences are an important part of this community, and your comments help guide the stories we tell in the future. If this journey touched you, inspired you, or simply kept you listening until the end, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel. Staying connected helps us continue sharing stories that honor resilience, hard-earned peace, and the courage to stand up for yourself. And if there's a story you want to hear, something personal, something emotional, or something you feel isn't talked about enough, please let me know in the comments. Your voice helps shape what comes next. Thank you again for being here, for listening with an open heart, and for allowing Jennifer's story to become part of your evening. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and I hope you'll join me for the next story.